I fully expected my ex-fiancé to destroy me in that courtroom. What I didn't expect was his legendary $5,000 an hour lawyer to slide her notepad across the table, containing a single handwritten sentence. "Keep your eyes on me, Chloe. I'm going to ruin him." If you love high-stakes drama, slow-burn tension, and women who could utterly dismantle your life with a single glance, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and tell me in the comments below, what is the most satisfying revenge you've ever gotten on an ex? Now, let's get into the story. Part 1: The Predator in Pinstripes. The air inside courtroom 4B of the Manhattan Civil District tasted like stale lemon cleaner, damp wool, and impending doom. I sat at the heavy mahogany defense table, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had turned the color of skim milk. I was wearing a cheap, off-the-rack beige blazer that pinched my shoulders every time I tried to take a full breath, though full breaths had been entirely out of my reach for the last 48 hours. Directly across the center aisle, sitting at the petitioner's table, was Liam. He looked sickeningly comfortable. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit, his golden brown hair pushed back with the exact brand of expensive matte pomade I used to buy for him when he couldn't afford his own groceries. He was leaning back in his wooden chair, quietly laughing at something his junior counsel had just whispered to him. Every few seconds, his eyes would drift across the aisle to me, holding a look of lazy, triumphant pity. The look of a boy who had trapped a moth under a glass and was casually waiting to decide when to shake it. He was trying to take Aura. Aura wasn't just a boutique digital branding agency, it was the marrow in my bones. For 4 years, I had worked 18-hour days, survived on lukewarm black coffee, and coded until the letters on my keyboard rubbed off to build that company from a folding table in my tiny Queens apartment into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Liam had contributed nothing more than the initial $50 domain registration fee on his credit card 4 years ago because my bank account had been temporarily overdrawn. 3 months ago, I finally realized that living with a covert, narcissistic parasite was killing my spirit, so I packed his things and set them outside my door. 2 weeks ago, his legal notice arrived. Exploiting a loophole in a handshake verbal agreement from our first year, Liam was claiming a 50% stakeholder equity in Aura, alongside an emergency ex parte injunction to freeze all of my operating accounts pending the trial. If the judge granted the freeze today, I wouldn't be able to make payroll by Friday. My 12 employees would leave. The server hosts would pull the plug. My life's work would evaporate into digital smoke, leaving Liam to pick up the brand name for pennies on the dollar. And to ensure my absolute execution, Liam hadn't just hired a lawyer. He had gone to his wealthy family, begged for a blank check, and retained Crawford, Sterling, and Vance. Specifically, the lead partner on the filing was Vivian Crawford. In the New York corporate litigation circuit, Vivian Crawford wasn't viewed as an attorney. She was viewed as an apex predator. She was the woman massive tech conglomerates called in when they didn't just want to win a settlement, they wanted the opposing CEO to publicly apologize and file for Chapter 7. She was notoriously glacial, entirely undefeated, and rumored to possess a heart made of compressed volcanic glass. I, on the other hand, was currently being represented by myself, because every reputable defense attorney I had tried to consult over the last 14 days had taken one look at Vivian Crawford's name on the docket, winced, and told me they didn't have the bandwidth. 2 minutes to the bench, people, the court bailiff barked, his voice echoing off the high, yellowing plaster ceilings. Liam caught my eye again. He raised his right hand, tapping the face of the vintage silver Omega watch I had bought him for his 30th birthday, giving me a mock, sorrowful little pout. "Tick-tock, Chloe." I closed my eyes, a hot, humiliating sting of tears pressing behind my eyelids. "Don't cry. If you cry in front of him, you lose the only piece of dignity you have left." Then, the heavy double oak doors at the back of the gallery groaned open. The ambient chatter in the courtroom didn't just quiet down, it died. It was as if someone had pulled the plug on the room's atmospheric pressure. I opened my eyes and looked over my shoulder. Walking down the center aisle was a woman who looked like she had been rendered out of sharp angles, expensive wool, and midnight. She was tall, easily 5'11" in her black pointed Louboutin stilettos, wearing a flawless 3-piece charcoal pinstripe suit that hugged an intensely commanding silhouette. Her dark, razor-straight hair was tucked impeccably behind her ears, exposing a jawline that could have cut glass. It was Vivian Crawford. The air in the room suddenly smelled faintly of crushed cedarwood, expensive rain, and a terrifying amount of money. Liam instantly sat up straight, his lazy arrogance vanishing as he smoothed down his tie. A bright, eager, dog-like smile broke across his face. He half stood from his chair, preparing to greet his magnificent weapon. "Vivian," he whispered audibly across the quiet room. "Right on time. The judge is about to—" Vivian Crawford did not look at him. She didn't even turn her head 10 degrees to the left. She walked straight past the petitioner's table, her heels striking the polished marble floor in a slow, rhythmic clack-clack-clack that sounded like the cocking of a very expensive shotgun. She stepped up to the defense table. "My table." She set her slim, black calfskin briefcase down onto the scarred mahogany right next to my legal pad. My breath caught in my throat, trapping itself behind my ribs. I stared up at her, completely paralyzed. Close, her skin was the color of pale porcelain, and her eyes weren't just brown. They were a dark, mesmerizing obsidian that seemed to absorb every stray beam of light in the room. She reached out with a long, manicured hand, pulled the wooden chair out beside me, and sat down. Her posture was so intensely rigid and perfect it made my own slumped spine feel like a mortal sin. She unbuttoned the center button of her tailored jacket, turned her head, and looked directly into my eyes. The sheer, concentrated weight of her gaze hit me like a physical blow. My stomach did a violent, erratic somersault. "You're hyperventilating, Miss Davies," she said. Her voice was a low, smoky contralto. It didn't carry across the room. It was pitched entirely for me, vibrating with a dark, terrifyingly steady authority. My voice cracked instantly, sounding like a dry twig snapping. You're at the wrong table. Liam is over there." "I am fully aware of where Liam is," Vivian replied, her tone as smooth as a freshly polished guillotine. "His cheap aftershave has been offending my olfactory senses from 3 miles away for the better part of a month." I blinked, my brain entirely failing to process the English language. "What?" "I was Liam's counsel," she said, slowly opening her briefcase and extracting a single pristine stack of legal documents. "Until yesterday afternoon at 4 p.m. when I conducted a deeper audit of his submitted exhibits. I found his claim to your source code fundamentally fraudulent, his sense of entitlement profoundly unearned, and his overall personality deeply, acutely exhausting." She set a heavy silver Mont Blanc pen beside her papers. "So," she continued, her dark eyes dropping to my trembling hands, then sweeping slowly up the length of my throat before locking onto my eyes once more. "I formally withdrew as his representation. I returned his family's retainer. And I filed an emergency substitution of counsel." The room started to spin. A substitution for who? A tiny, dangerously sharp micro-expression flickered at the very corner of her painted lips. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the look of a hawk watching a field mouse realize it was under a wing. "For you, Miss Davies. I am taking your case pro bono." "Why?" I breathed out, the word escaping me like a dying gasp. "You don't even know me." Vivian leaned in a fraction of an inch closer. The scent of her cedarwood perfume washed over my senses, making my skin prickle with a sudden, shocking heat. "Because I have an extreme personal aversion to watching mediocre men try to break extraordinary women," she murmured softly. "Now, sit up straight. Put your hands on the table. And do not look at him again." Before I could even attempt to form a syllable of a reply, the door behind the bench swung wide. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Arthur Abernathy." Courtroom scrambled to its feet. Judge Abernathy, a tired-looking man in his late 60s with half-moon spectacles, shuffled up to his high leather chair, sat down, and picked up the top file of his morning stack. He sighed, adjusting his glasses. "All right. Docket 402, Liam Vance versus Chloe Davies. The motion for an emergency preliminary asset freeze." Abernathy looked over the rim of his glasses toward Liam's table. I see the petitioner is present. Counsel, state your. Vivian Crawford stood up. She didn't just stand, she claimed the vertical space of the room. Vivian Crawford, Your Honor. Entering my formal appearance on behalf of the respondent, Miss Chloe Davies. If a bomb had gone off in the center aisle, it would have produced less of a kinetic reaction from the petitioner's table. Liam's jaw literally unhinged. The smug golden boy mask shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces of pure, pale, unadulterated panic. He scrambled halfway out of his chair, his hands slamming onto his table. What? He hissed, his voice cracking into a frantic, high-pitched screech. No. Your Honor, what is this? She's my lawyer. My father paid her firm $200,000. Mr. Vance, control yourself or the bailiff will seat you forcibly. Judge Abernathy barked, banging his gavel once. The judge turned a deeply bewildered look toward our table. Counselor Crawford, this is highly irregular. Your firm's name was on the original petition against the respondent. A petition drafted by a junior associate acting on demonstrably falsified affidavits provided by Mr. Vance, Your Honor, Vivian responded smoothly, her voice ringing out with crystal-clear, devastating projection. Upon discovering the perjury, my firm withdrew. Furthermore, as no privileged defense strategies were disclosed to me by Mr. Vance regarding his actual claim, primarily because no valid legal claim exists, the State Ethics Board granted my emergency waiver to represent Miss Davies at 8 a.m. this morning. Your Honor, I object. Liam's new junior counsel stammered, sweating profusely through his collar. This is a profound conflict of. Overruled, Abernathy grunted, waving a dismissive hand. If the State Board cleared the ethics check, she's in the game. Let's hear the arguments for the asset freeze. Petitioner claims Miss Davies is actively attempting to liquidate joint digital assets. What followed for the next 20 minutes was not a legal proceeding. It was a live, televised public execution. Vivian Crawford didn't just dismantle Liam's motion, she surgically vivisected it. With a terrifying, quiet efficiency, she submitted 3 separate digital forensic reports proving Liam had attempted to forge the timestamps on the original Aura domain receipts. She cited 4 obscure appellate court precedents regarding bad faith conversion of digital intellectual property, speaking without ever once checking her notes. But the thing that made my blood run hot beneath my cheap blazer, the thing that was making it entirely impossible for me to keep my sanity intact, was her body language. While she stood at the podium, speaking to the judge in that commanding, smoky voice, she rested her left hand casually on the corner of my table. And every time she dropped a devastating, inescapable trap onto Liam's case, she didn't look at the judge to check his reaction. She looked back at me. She would turn her head slightly, let those dark, heavy obsidian eyes lock onto mine, and watch my reaction. She watched the way my chest heaved. She watched the way my parted lips trembled. Felt intensely, overwhelmingly private, as if the two of us were standing alone inside a soundproof glass box while Liam burned to ash on the outside. In summary, Your Honor, Vivian said, her eyes still fixed intensely on my mouth as she delivered the final blow to the bench, the petitioner's motion is not merely frivolous, it is a textbook instance of malicious prosecution designed to starve a woman-owned enterprise into a coerced settlement. We request the motion for the freeze be denied with prejudice, and we serve immediate notice of a countersuit against Mr. Vance for tortious interference, seeking punitive damages to the tune of $4.5 million. A collective, stunned gasp rippled through the handful of spectators in the gallery. Liam looked like he was going to vomit into his lap. He was shaking so hard his silver watch was vibrating against the wood of his table. Judge Abernathy stared at the submitted forensic reports for a long, heavy silence. Finally, he took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. I am going to take a 15-minute recess in my chambers to review these timestamp logs. If these forensic exhibits hold up, Counselor, the court will be denying the freeze and Mr. Vance. Abernathy glared at Liam. I suggest you use these 15 minutes to call a criminal defense attorney regarding the submission of forged federal documents. Bang! The judge stood up and exited the bench. The moment the heavy door clicked shut behind the bench, the courtroom erupted into frantic murmurs. Liam lost the final tether of his sanity. His face turned a dangerous, mottled crimson. He shoved his junior lawyer out of the way, kicked his chair back, and marched directly across the aisle toward our table. "Vivian," he snarled, his voice dropping into a vicious, trembling register as he reached our side of the mahogany divide. "What the actual fuck do you think you're doing? My family made your firm. You signed an ironclad non-disclosure." Vivian Crawford didn't rush. She took 3 slow, agonizingly poised seconds to screw the silver cap back onto her Montblanc pen. Then she stood up. When she rose to her full height in those Louboutins, she looked down at Liam from an altitude of pure aristocratic disdain. She took 1 step to the left, placing her body entirely between Liam and me, completely cutting him off from my view like an eclipse shutting out a dying star. "Your father pays Crawford, Sterling, and Vance for our discretion, little boy," Vivian said. Her voice dropped so low it felt like the sudden, cold drop in cabin pressure right before an airplane loses its wing. "He does not own my leash. And he certainly does not pay me to help his wildly insecure, talentless son rob a woman because he lacked the basic intellectual capacity to match her." Liam's jaw worked silently, his eyes bulging as he tried to summon a threat. "I'll have you disbarred. I'll call the Bar Association before noon." "Do it," Vivian whispered, taking 1 step closer to him, forcing Liam to instinctively stumble a step backward. Her eyes narrowed into 2 terrifying black slits. "And while you're on the phone with them, I will place a call to the SEC regarding the Series B shell companies your little crypto startup has been routing through the Cayman Islands. The ones registered under your mother's maiden name. Do we understand each other, Mr. Vance?" The color vanished from Liam's face so fast it looked like a magic trick. He stood there, completely paralyzed, his breath whistling through his nose in pathetic, shallow little gasps. "Get back to your side of the aisle," Vivian commanded softly. "You are polluting my client's breathing space." Liam swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Without a single word of rebuttal, he turned on his heel and retreated to his table like a kicked dog, sinking into his chair and putting his head in his hands. Vivian watched him go with a look of profound, absolute boredom. Then she turned back around to face me. The terrifying, cold-blooded legal executioner vanished in an instant. As she looked down at me still sitting in my chair, the atmosphere between us shifted, growing thick, heavy, and dangerously warm. She sat back down. She didn't reorganize her files. Instead, she rested her elbow on the table, propped her chin upon her knuckles, and angled her entire body toward me. Her obsidian eyes tracked the messy tendril of hair that had escaped my bun, tracing a slow, burning path down my cheek, lingering on the rapid, frantic pulsing of the vein at the side of my neck. Slowly, her manicured fingertips extended across the mahogany. She caught the top edge of my legal pad, and with a gentle, deliberate pressure, slid it 2 inches toward my chest. Written across the very top line of the yellow paper in sharp, aggressive, beautiful cursive was the sentence from my hook. "Keep your eyes on me, Chloe. I'm going to ruin him." I looked from the paper up to her face. My lips parted, my breath coming out in a hot, ragged flutter. "You're—" I couldn't finish the thought. Vivian's gaze dropped to my parted lips, a dark, possessive satisfaction settling into her features. She reached out, the tips of her warm fingers grazing the very edge of my trembling hand just enough to send a bolt of pure, liquid electricity shooting straight up my arm. "You're shaking again, little bird," she murmured, her voice dropping into a register so dark and intimate it felt like a secret kept in the dark. "Tell me, do you want the judge to throw his case out today? Or do you want me to drag this out for another month just so we have an excuse to keep seeing each other?" End of Part 1. Part 2, The Terms of Surrender. The silence stretching between Vivian Crawford and me was so absolute I could hear the faint, frantic ticking of the cheap quartz watch on my own wrist. My brain was a short-circuiting switchboard. Did New York's most ruthless corporate litigator just proposition me, or was this some sort of high-level psychological cross-examination? I looked down at our hands. Her skin was warm, smooth, and smelled faintly of expensive French moisturizer. My own hand was calloused at the side of the palm from 4 years of resting against the hard edge of a MacBook, the cuticles bitten raw from anxiety. I tried to pull back, but her thumb exerted a microscopic fraction of downward pressure. It wasn't enough to trap me. If I yanked my arm away, she would have let go instantly, but it was enough to act as an anchor. It was a physical gravity holding me to the earth. I swallowed, my throat bone dry. I have 12 developers whose rent, groceries, and lives depend on Friday's payroll. If this drags out for another month, Aura goes into receivership. My people get evicted. Vivian's dark obsidian eyes didn't leave mine, but the sharp, predatory amusement in her expression softened by a fraction of a millimeter. It was the first genuine, uncalculated look I had seen on her face since she walked through the double doors. "Pragmatic," she murmured, her thumb giving the side of my knuckle one last, lingering sweep before she gracefully withdrew her hand. "I adore pragmatism in a partner, Miss Davies." Before I could ask her to define the word partner, the heavy oak door behind the bench clicked, and the bailiff stood up. "All rise." Judge Abernathy re-entered the courtroom, his robes billowing slightly behind him. He looked like a man who had spent the last 15 minutes looking at something that gave him a profound existential migraine. He sat down, bypassed his gavel entirely, and folded his hands over the stack of digital forensic printouts. He didn't look at Vivian. He didn't look at me. He looked directly at Liam. "Mr. Vance," the judge began, his voice dropping into a register of quiet, lethal exhaustion. "In my 32 years on the civil bench, I have seen standard corporate puffery. I have seen creative accounting. What I have very rarely seen is an individual hand-deliver an uncertified, altered PDF timestamp to a New York State judge and attempt to pass it off as an authentic Network Solutions domain receipt." Liam's face turned the color of wet chalk. "Your Honor, my assistant handled the gathering of those specific files. I can't be held responsible for." "Do not insult my intelligence or my calendar, Mr. Vance," Abernathy snapped. "The petitioner's motion for an emergency ex parte asset freeze is denied in its entirety." A sound left my mouth, a tiny, ragged, pathetic little gasp of trapped air. My vision blurred instantly as the crushing, suffocating weight of the last 2 weeks suddenly dissolved into the Manhattan air. We were safe. Payroll would go through. Aura belonged to me. Furthermore, Judge Abernathy continued, speaking over Liam's frantic, whispering attempts to consult his sweating junior lawyer, in light of the demonstrably fraudulent nature of Exhibit C, this court is entering a formal show cause order. Mr. Vance, you and your current legal counsel have 14 business days to explain to this court why you should not be sanctioned for perjury and referred to the district attorney's office for the offering of a false instrument for filing. The judge picked up his wooden gavel and let it fall with a sharp, definitive crack. "This matter is adjourned. Clerk, set a status conference for 30 days on the respondent's countersuit. Have a good afternoon, Counselor Crawford." "Always a pleasure, Your Honor," Vivian replied smoothly. The judge stood and left. The second the door closed, the dam broke. A single, hot, embarrassing tear spilled over my lower eyelid, cutting a wet track down my cheek. I reached up hastily with the sleeve of my terrible beige blazer to scrub it away, terrified of looking weak, but before the rough polyester could touch my face, a square of cool, crisp white fabric appeared in my peripheral vision. I looked down. Resting on top of my legal pad was a pristine, pressed linen handkerchief. In the bottom right corner, embroidered in pale silver silk thread, were the initials VC. "Dry your face, Miss Davies," Vivian said. Her voice was brisk, professional, and entirely devoid of the smoky intimacy from 3 minutes ago. She was already standing up, snapping the polished silver clasps of her calfskin briefcase shut with 2 sharp clicks. Tears are a biological response to the sudden metabolized release of cortisol. It is scientifically normal, but the hallway outside is currently occupied by a reporter from the New York Law Journal, and I do not permit my clients to be photographed looking like victims. I took the handkerchief. The linen smelled intensely of her cedarwood perfume. I pressed it to my eyes, taking a long, shaky, oxygen-rich breath. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said, checking a slim silver Patek Philippe watch on her wrist. "My driver has been double-parked on Center Street for 22 minutes. The traffic enforcement officers in this ward are notoriously immune to my charm. Gather your effects." Across the aisle, Liam was shoving his laptop into his leather bag so violently the zipper caught. His junior attorney was already walking rapidly up the center aisle, visibly putting as much physical distance between himself and his soon-to-be disbarred client as humanly possible. Liam stopped at the edge of our table. His eyes were red-rimmed, his golden boy hair finally falling out of its perfect pomaded sweep. He looked at me, his mouth opening to deliver some sort of desperate, venomous parting shot. Vivian didn't even look up from adjusting her suit cuffs. "If a single syllable exits your oral cavity within 20 feet of this woman, Mr. Vance, I will ensure the SEC freezing order includes your personal checking account by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Walk away." Liam's jaw snapped shut so hard his teeth clicked. He shot me one last look of pure, impotent hatred, turned on his heel, and practically jogged out of the courtroom. "Come," Vivian said. Walking out of the Manhattan Civil Courthouse beside Vivian Crawford was a masterclass in social physics. Felt like walking next to a localized weather event. In the grand, echoing marble lobby, groups of arguing attorneys, stressed paralegals, and somber litigants naturally parted for her like the Red Sea. Seasoned partners from rival firms gave her slight, deferential nods of the head. Junior associates practically pressed their spines against the marble pillars to ensure their briefcases didn't accidentally graze her pinstripes. She moved with an effortless, sweeping stride, her black Louboutins echoing off the stone floor, never once looking back to see if I was keeping up. She simply assumed I was. We pushed through the heavy brass revolving doors and out into the blinding, humid glare of a New York Tuesday. Idling at the curb, directly in the red no-standing zone, was a massive, pitch-black Maybach S-Class. The moment we stepped onto the concrete, a driver in a sharp gray suit jumped out, rounded the hood, and held the rear passenger door open, offering Vivian a respectful dip of his chin. "Afternoon, Ms. Crawford." "Afternoon, Marcus," she said. She turned, using one long arm to gesture toward the dark, cavernous leather interior of the car. "Get in, Chloe." It was the first time she had used my first name in an open, unwhispered setting. It sounded weirdly heavy coming from her mouth, like a formal title. I stopped on the sidewalk, the sweltering city heat immediately making the back of my neck prickle. The high adrenaline euphoria of the courtroom victory was suddenly beginning to wear off, leaving behind the cold, sober reality of my situation. "No," I said, my voice remarkably steady for a woman whose knees were currently made of wet papier-mâché. Vivian paused, her hand resting on the polished chrome of the doorframe. She turned her head slowly, her dark brows raising about 1/8 of an inch. "No." "No," I repeated, clutching my cheap pleather tote bag to my chest like a shield. "I don't get into black cars with people whose billing rate is higher than my company's monthly health insurance premium without knowing the invoice terms. You just saved my life inside that room. I am profoundly, unimaginably grateful. But nobody in this city does anything for free. Especially not someone from Crawford, Sterling, and Vance. So before I step inside that spaceship of a car, I want you to look me in the eye and tell me what the catch is." The driver, Marcus, kept his eyes locked strictly on the asphalt, his face a mask of practiced, professional non-existence. Vivian looked at me. She looked at my messy hair, my pinched, defensive shoulders, my scuffed loafers, and the white monogrammed handkerchief still gripped tightly in my fist. Slowly, the corner of her mouth ticked upward into a slow, devastatingly sharp smile. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. "The catch, Miss Davies," she murmured, stepping back off the curb until she was standing just 12 inches from me, forcing me to tilt my head up to meet her eyes, "is that yesterday at midnight I sat in my office and read 4,000 lines of your proprietary back-end compression code." I blinked, thrown entirely off balance. You read my source code?" "I did," she said softly. And what I realized around line 2000 was that your ex-fiancé is an intellectual peasant who happened to stumble upon a diamond mine and spent 4 years trying to convince the diamond that it was just a piece of particularly shiny glass. She reached out. Her long, manicured index finger caught the cheap, frayed polyester lapel of my beige blazer. She rubbed the fabric between her thumb and forefinger with a brief, theatrical shudder of absolute aristocratic disgust. "I don't want your money, Chloe." "I have more money than the Vatican," Vivian said, her voice dropping back into that dark, private, magnetic register that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. "What I want is to put you inside a glass laboratory, hand you an unlimited line of credit, and watch what happens to the North American digital marketing sector when you are finally allowed to be lethal." She let go of my lapel, her hand sliding down to rest lightly, immovably against the small of my back. The heat of her palm radiated straight through the cheap fabric. "Step 1, she whispered, leaning down just enough that her lips were hovering an inch from my ear, her breath sending a wild electric shiver straight down my spine. "We are driving to Bergdorf Goodman to throw this catastrophic garment into an industrial incinerator. Step 2, we are going to my penthouse to drink very old scotch and sign your new corporate charter. Now, be a good girl, get in the car and let me do my job." My brain screamed at me to run to the nearest subway station. My survival instincts told me that getting into a car with Vivian Crawford was the emotional equivalent of stepping into a tiger enclosure coated in steak sauce. I looked at the open door. I looked at her dark, waiting, inescapable eyes. I got in the car. End of part 2. Part 3, the architecture of an ego. The moment the heavy, double-sealed door of the Maybach clicked shut, the frantic, sweltering roar of downtown Manhattan was instantly deleted. It didn't just get quiet, it became a vacuum. The interior of the car smelled of bespoke Napa leather, chilled air, and the faint, intoxicating lingering of Vivian's cedarwood perfume. Before I could even figure out what to do with my awkward, scuffed loafers on the pristine lambswool floor mats, Vivian reached out and pressed a polished silver button on the center console. With a low, motorized whir, an opaque glass partition glided silently upward, sealing the two of us off entirely from Marcus in the driver's seat. The sudden, absolute privacy made my pulse spike so hard I could feel it in my molars. "You look as though you're calculating the terminal velocity of a jump from a moving vehicle," Vivian remarked. She opened a small, illuminated, refrigerated compartment between the seats, retrieved 2 frosted glass bottles of San Pellegrino, and handed one across to me. "I'm calculating whether I've just been rescued or abducted," I said, taking the cold glass. My hands were still trembling faintly, the adrenaline of the courtroom finally crashing into a wave of profound, hollow exhaustion. "People like you don't play fairy godmother, Vivian. What happens when we get to Bergdorf Goodman? Do I sign over my firstborn at the jewelry counter?" Vivian unscrewed the cap of her water with a soft hiss, her dark eyes glinting with a sharp, lethal amusement. "If I wanted to abduct you, Chloe, we would be driving to Teterboro Airport to board my Gulfstream, not cruising up Fifth Avenue," she said smoothly, taking a slow sip. "And as for the clothes, consider it an aggressive preliminary injunction against your own imposter syndrome. In corporate New York, a cheap polyester suit is an open wound. Tells the sharks in the room that your credit limit is under $5,000, your legal counsel is non-existent, and your panic is easily exploitable. You are the CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech firm. It is high time your silhouette stopped apologizing for it." She leaned her head back against the black leather headrest, turning her face toward me. In the dim, soft lighting of the cabin, the sharp, severe angles of her jaw looked sculpted out of pale marble. "Besides," she murmured, her gaze dropping to the frayed hem of my sleeve, "if I have to look across a mahogany conference table at that catastrophic shade of beige for one more afternoon, I am going to hold Liam personally liable for my emotional distress." 20 minutes later, the Maybach glided to a halt at the side entrance of Bergdorf Goodman. We didn't walk through the main retail floor. We were greeted at a private, frosted glass elevator by a woman in a razor-sharp black sheath dress who looked at Vivian the way medieval peasants probably looked at a visiting archduchess. We were whisked directly up to the third-floor private personal shopping suites, a sprawling, sun-drenched sanctuary of cream velvet sofas, gilded mirrors, and zero price tags. Vivian, darling, it has been an absolute age, a sleek, silver-haired personal shopper named Giselle purred, sweeping into the room with 2 flutes of champagne. Vivian didn't take the champagne. She stood in the center of the suite, her hands deep in the pockets of her pinstriped trousers, acting as an executive general surveying a battlefield. Giselle, we have a total systemic teardown, Vivian commanded, her voice dropping into its brisk, terrifyingly efficient boardroom register. Miss Davies needs 3 working armors. No pastels. No double-breasted cuts. She has the collarbones for severe, single-button deep lapels. I want a midnight navy, a charcoal slate, and an undyed Italian raw silk combination. And get this garment off her body immediately before my retinas detach. Before I could protest, Giselle and an assistant had practically floated me into a massive 3-way mirrored dressing alcove. When I took off the beige blazer, leaving myself standing in just my black silk camisole and my slacks, a hot flush of acute vulnerability hit me. For 4 years, I had hidden my body behind oversized hoodies and cheap, shapeless blazers, treating my physical self as a mere transport vessel for my brain. Looking at my reflection, pale, exhausted, with dark purple crescents under my eyes, I felt impossibly small. Then the velvet curtain parted. Vivian didn't send Giselle back in. She stepped into the threshold of the dressing room herself, carrying a hanger bearing a breathtaking, custom-tailored ivory silk jacket. She stopped. Her obsidian eyes locked onto my reflection in the mirror, taking in the bare expanse of my shoulders, the dip of my collarbones, the rapid, shallow rise and fall of my chest against the black silk of my camisole. The silence in the small dressing alcove became instantly, suffocatingly heavy. The air grew thick, charged with the sudden, sharp prickle of static electricity. Slowly, she stepped behind me. She didn't hand me the jacket. She draped it over my shoulders herself. As the cool, heavy Italian silk settled over my skin, Vivian's hands rested on the peaks of my shoulders. Her thumbs brushed the bare skin just above the fabric. Her touch was impossibly warm, sending a wild, liquid jolt of pure heat straight down my spine that made my breath catch audibly in my throat. She didn't pull her hands away. She leaned in, her tall frame positioning itself directly behind mine in the glass, her chin hovering just an inch from my right shoulder. "Look at her," Vivian whispered to the mirror. Her smoky, low contralto vibrated right against the shell of my ear, making the fine hairs on my neck stand straight up. I looked at the glass. The woman staring back at me didn't look like Liam's frantic, discarded victim. The severe, masterfully tailored shoulders of the ivory silk framed my pale face like a modern Renaissance portrait, made my posture instantly snap straight, made my eyes look dark, focused, and dangerously awake. "That is the woman who engineered an 8-gigabit lossless compression pipeline," Vivian murmured softly, her manicured fingers slowly smoothing down the lapels of the jacket, her knuckles grazing the soft rise of my chest just enough to make my stomach do a violent, erratic flip. "That is the woman Liam spent 4 years trying to convince was a spectator in her own life. Memorize this reflection, Chloe. Because tomorrow morning, the rest of this city is going to have to look at her too." I couldn't speak. I looked from my reflection to hers, to those dark, inescapable, fiercely intelligent eyes watching me in the mirror with a look of intense, almost terrifying possessiveness. "Keep the ivory," Vivian said, her voice suddenly dropping an octave lower, dark and gravelly. "It makes you look like an executioner." By 7 o'clock that evening, the Maybach had deposited us inside the private subterranean garage of a high-rise on the edge of Tribeca. Vivian's penthouse didn't look like an apartment, it looked like an art gallery perched at the edge of the stratosphere. It was a massive, sweeping expanse of polished dark concrete, minimalist black walnut furniture, and 20-foot floor-to-ceiling glass panes that offered an unobstructed, dizzying view of the Hudson River turning the color of bruised plums in the sunset. "Sit," Vivian said, tossing her calfskin briefcase onto a massive 10-foot dining table carved from a single slab of black timber. She walked over to a sleek, illuminated wet bar, took down a heavy crystal decanter, and poured 2 neat fingers of deep amber liquid into a pair of Baccarat double old-fashioned glasses. She carried them over, setting one down on the dark wood in front of me before sliding a thick 30-page document printed on heavy archival paper across the table. "Drink," she ordered. And read. I took a sip of the scotch. It was impossibly smooth, tasting of old peat, dark honey, and expensive smoke, sending a slow, steadying ribbon of warmth into my empty stomach. I set the crystal glass down, picked up the silver Mont Blanc pen she had left beside the stack, and pulled the document toward me. Master Operating and Equity Restructuring Agreement, Aura Digital Solutions. My tech founder instincts instantly overtook my lingering dizziness. I flipped past the standard indemnification clauses, bypassed the non-disclosures, and went straight to Section 4, Capitalization and Equity Distribution. This was the moment the trap would spring. This was where the legendary Vivian Crawford collected her pound of flesh for saving my life. I traced my index finger down the columns of legalese, reading the bolded text silently. Then I stopped. I blinked, rereading the paragraph 3 times to make sure the Macallan wasn't causing a cognitive misfire. I looked up. Vivian was leaning her hip against the edge of the black walnut table, slowly swirling the amber liquid in her glass, watching me with an expression of total, unreadable calm. "Vivian," I said, my voice tight. "This says, Crawford Ventures hereby extends a non-callable revolving credit facility of $2 million to Aura Digital Solutions, in exchange for..." I stopped, pointing the tip of the silver pen at the paper. 5% of non-voting advisory shares? Your reading comprehension remains flawless, Miss Davies. 5%. I stood up from the chair, the sheer absurdity of the math making me raise my voice. Vivian, standard venture capital incubators take 40% for a basic seed round. Liam tried to steal 50% for doing literally nothing. 5% of a company of my scale is a rounding error to a woman who wears Patek Philippe watches. Why are you handing me 95% of my own life's work back on a silver platter? What is the catch? Vivian didn't flinch at my tone. She set her crystal glass down onto the table with a soft, definitive clink. Slowly, she pushed herself off the edge of the wood and walked the 3 short steps over to where I was standing. She didn't stop at a polite, professional distance. She stepped right into my personal space, towering over me in her stilettos, forcing me to tilt my chin up to keep her eyes in my sights. She reached out. Her warm, long index finger caught the silver Mont Blanc pen in my trembling grip, gently prying it out of my fingers and tossing it onto the open contract. Then, her hand moved up, her palm coming to rest flat against the side of my neck, her long thumb resting right over the frantic, hammering pulse at my jawline. "Because if I take 40%, Chloe, you become my employee," Vivian whispered. The smell of the scotch on her breath mingled with the cedarwood, warm and intoxicating. Her dark, heavy obsidian eyes dropped down to my parted lips, lingering there for 3 agonizing, burning seconds before slowly lifting back up to hold my gaze. "And I have 140 exceptional employees at my firm. What I do not have..." Her thumb exerted the slightest, most maddeningly gentle pressure against my skin, sending a hot, paralyzing shiver straight down to my toes. "Is an equal." End of Part 3. Part 4, The Geometry of a Trap. The silence in the penthouse was broken only by the distant, muffled hum of the Manhattan traffic 300 feet below, and the frantic, deafening hammering of my own pulse against Vivian's thumb. An equal? No one in my entire life had ever looked at me and used that word. To Liam, I had been an ATM machine attached to a keyboard. To my investors, I was a high-yield algorithm. Even to my own employees, I was the frantic, exhausted firewall standing between them and unemployment. But standing here, in the dim, golden light of the skyline sunset, Vivian Crawford was looking at me as though I was the most dangerous, fascinating creature she had ever encountered. I was terrified. I was completely out of my depth. And I had never wanted anything more in my entire life. I reached up, my smaller, trembling fingers wrapping around her wrist. I didn't pull her hand away from my neck. I just held her there, my skin burning beneath the cool silver links of her Patek Philippe watch. "I don't know how to play this game, Vivian," I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly small in the vast expanse of the room. "I write back-end database architecture. I don't know the rules of whatever this is." Vivian's dark eyes softened, the ruthless corporate predator melting away into something infinitely darker and much more private. A slow, breathtaking smile curved her painted lips. "There are no rules, Chloe," she murmured softly, her thumb brushing a slow, tracing path along the line of my jaw. "Except the ones I write. And the first rule is that you sign that charter. You secure your company. You let me place a titanium vault around your assets, so Liam Vance can spend the rest of his pathetic life trying to chip away at the steel and breaking his own teeth in the process." She slowly withdrew her hand from my neck, the loss of her touch leaving a cold, hollow ache against my skin. She tapped the heavy archival paper resting on the table. "Sign the paper. Then we eat dinner." I picked up the heavy Mont Blanc pen. The silver barrel felt warm from her hand. I flipped to the back page, located the signature line above the words Chloe Davies, Chief Executive Officer, and signed my name. The moment the ink dried, the suffocating 2-week-long vice grip around my chest finally truly shattered. Aura was mine. I had survived the kill shot. Vivian picked up the contract, snapping it smartly into a black leather folder. "Excellent. The wire transfer for the $2 million will clear into your operational accounts by 9 a.m. tomorrow. Now come." I ordered omakase from a place in Midtown that doesn't publicly exist. It should be waiting in the kitchen. The next 72 hours moved at the speed of a high-frequency trading algorithm. Wednesday morning, I walked into the Aura offices wearing the custom-tailored charcoal slate suit Vivian had chosen for me. I didn't scurry to my desk with my head down. I walked through the bullpen with my spine straight, the heavy Italian wool making my shoulders look broad and immovable. When I called my lead developers into the glass conference room and informed them that the emergency freeze had been dismissed with prejudice, and that we had secured a $2 million war chest from Crawford Ventures overnight, the room erupted. My lead engineer, Marcus, practically threw his coffee mug in the air. By Thursday afternoon, the legal aftershocks began. I was sitting in my office, reviewing a beta deployment for a new client, when my cell phone vibrated violently against the wood of my desk. Incoming call, Liam Vance. My stomach gave a phantom lurch of anxiety, an old, conditioned reflex of fear. But then I looked down at the sleeve of my suit. I remembered the heavy, warm weight of Vivian's hand against my throat. I remembered the contract sitting in her vault. I swiped the green icon and put the phone on speaker. "Chloe," Liam's voice crackled through the speaker. He didn't sound like the arrogant golden boy predator from courtroom 4B. He sounded ragged, frantic, and small. "Chloe, please tell me you haven't blocked me yet. I need to talk to you." I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair, steepling my fingers. "You have exactly 60 seconds before I forward this recorded call to my attorney as a violation of the pending tortious interference suit. Start talking." You recorded me?" he stammered, the panic spiking in his throat. "Chloe, look, things got out of hand. My father's lawyers reviewed the court transcript. They saw the forensic packet Vivian submitted. My dad he's pulling my trust fund. He's furious. And the junior partner who helped me file the exhibit? He's turning state's evidence for the DA. 40 seconds, I said smoothly. I was genuinely amazed at how steady my own voice sounded. "I'll drop the claim," he blurted out, the words tumbling over each other in desperate haste. "I'll sign a total release of equity. I'll walk away completely. I need you to drop the countersuit. I need you to call Vivian off. Please, Chloe. You know her. She's a monster. If she pursues the $4.5 million in punitive damages, I'll have to declare bankruptcy. My crypto startup is already bleeding cash. I'll lose everything. I sat in the silence for a moment, listening to his ragged, pathetic breathing. For 4 years, this man had belittled my intelligence, isolated me from my friends, and treated my ambition as a cute little hobby he permitted me to have. He had tried to steal my life's work with a forged PDF and a smug smile. "Liam," I said softly, leaning closer to the microphone. "Do you remember when you told me, right before I packed your bags, that I would never survive without your business acumen?" Silence hung heavy on the line. "Chloe, I was angry, I didn't mean." "I survived just fine," I interrupted, my voice dropping into a register of cold, absolute zero. "And as for calling my lawyer off, Vivian Crawford does exactly what I pay her to do. And I haven't even begun to tell her to stop. Have a wonderful bankruptcy, Liam." I ended the call, blocked the number, and tossed the phone onto my desk. A profound, terrifying wave of power washed over me. Felt like standing at the very edge of a cliff, the wind howling around me, knowing I finally had the wingspan to leap. Just as I took a deep breath, my office door swung open. My assistant, a bright-eyed 22-year-old named Sarah, stood in the threshold, her eyes wide as saucers, holding a massive, extravagant arrangement of deep, velvet black baccarat roses. Boss," Sarah squeaked, looking from the flowers to me. "Courier just dropped these off. They had to take the freight elevator because the box was so big." "Put them on the credenza," I said, my heart executing a flawless Olympic-level gymnastics routine in my chest. Sarah practically sprinted out of the room. I walked over to the black crystal vase. The roses smelled dark, rich, and impossibly expensive. Tucked between the dark green leaves was a thick cream-colored envelope bearing the embossed crest of Crawford, Sterling, and Vance. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of heavy cardstock, bearing that same sharp, aggressive, beautiful cursive I had seen on my legal pad in the courtroom. "Miss Davies." My contacts at the Bar Association informed me that Mr. Vance's junior counsel just flipped. "I assume the frantic, groveling phone call to your office has already occurred. I trust you handled it with the cold, lethal efficiency I expect from my partners. Wear the midnight navy suit tonight. My driver will collect you at 7 p.m. We are attending the American Bar Association Gala at the Pierre Hotel. It is time the corporate predators of this city learned exactly whose wing you are resting under. VC." 7 p.m. sharp, the Maybach was idling at the curb outside my apartment building. I slid into the cavernous, leather-scented interior, my pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was wearing the midnight navy suit Vivian had chosen. Beneath the tailored jacket, I wore nothing but a daringly low-cut black silk camisole. It was an outfit designed to drop jaws and silence rooms. "Evening, Miss Davies," Marcus said smoothly from the front seat, putting the car into gear. "Good evening, Marcus," I replied, smoothing the wool of my trousers, trying desperately to calm my nerves. We glided up Fifth Avenue, pulling up to the glittering, chaotic entrance of the Pierre Hotel. A small army of valets and doormen swarmed the curb, assisting tuxedo-clad lawyers and women in trailing evening gowns out of a line of luxury cars. I stepped out of the Maybach, the humid evening air instantly clinging to my skin. I took a deep breath, preparing to walk into the Lion's Den alone, when a sleek silver Aston Martin DB11 pulled smoothly into the space directly behind Marcus. The driver's side door opened. Vivian Crawford stepped out onto the concrete. The breath was completely stolen from my lungs. She wasn't wearing a standard evening gown. She was wearing a breathtaking, custom-tailored women's tuxedo in pitch-black velvet. The jacket was open, revealing a crisp white silk dress shirt unbuttoned dangerously low, with a loose, untied black silk bow tie hanging elegantly around her neck. Her dark hair was swept back, her jawline looking sharper and more devastating than ever. She tossed the keys to a terrified-looking valet, didn't wait for a receipt, and walked directly toward me. She stopped 18 inches away. Her obsidian eyes swept over the midnight navy suit, dropping to the exposed skin at my collarbones, before slowly dragging back up to meet my gaze. The heat radiating off her body in the humid air was intoxicating. You obeyed instructions, Vivian murmured, her low contralto vibrating through the noise of the street. You look spectacular. You look. My brain entirely failed to formulate an adjective worthy of the velvet tuxedo. You're driving yourself tonight. I find manual transmissions therapeutic after a long day of destroying men's careers, she said, her lips curving into a dangerous half-smile. She reached out, her hands smoothly catching the inside of my elbow. Come. Let's give the shark something to bleed over. She led me up the marble steps and into the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel. The moment we stepped through the gilded double doors, the ambient roar of 1,000 networking lawyers hit us like a physical wall. The room was a sea of black ties, clinking champagne flutes, and calculating eyes. But as Vivian Crawford walked into the room, a subtle, unmistakable ripple of silence began to spread outward from the entrance. Heads turned. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Eyes locked onto the velvet tuxedo, and then invariably they shifted to me. Vivian didn't stop. She didn't let go of my arm. She guided me flawlessly through the crowd, parting the room with the sheer, terrifying gravity of her presence. She led us toward a high-top table near the bar, currently occupied by 3 older, extremely distinguished-looking men in expensive tuxedos. One of them, a man with silver hair and a sharp, hawkish nose, looked up as we approached, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Vivian," the man said, his voice carrying the distinct, gravelly weight of old money and immense power. "I didn't think you'd show your face tonight. Not after the stunt you pulled in district court on Tuesday." Vivian stopped at the table, her hands still resting possessively on my arm. She looked at the man with an expression of profound, glacial boredom. "Arthur," Vivian replied smoothly, "if I cared about the opinions of men who still dictate their emails to their secretaries, I would have stayed home. I believe you are familiar with the rumors of my new client." She stepped slightly to the side, angling me forward into the light of the chandelier. "Gentlemen," Vivian announced, her voice ringing out clear and cold above the din of the room. "Allow me to introduce Chloe Davies, CEO of Aura Digital, and the woman who just acquired the exclusive operational backing of Crawford Ventures." The silver-haired man, who I suddenly recognized from Forbes magazine as Arthur Vance, Liam's billionaire father, stared at me. Color drained from his face, leaving him looking suddenly very old and very frail. This is the girl?" Arthur stammered, his eyes darting to Vivian. "You tanked my son's life over a startup founder?" Vivian's hand slid from my elbow, wrapping firmly around the small of my back. She pulled me flush against her side, her dark eyes locking onto Arthur Vance with a look of pure, unadulterated warning. "I tanked your son's life, Arthur, because he had the audacity to touch something that belongs to me," Vivian whispered, her voice dropping into a register of sheer, protective violence. "Now, walk away. Before I decide to look into your offshore accounts, too." End of Part 4. Part 5, The Anatomy of a Claim. The silence that followed Vivian's words was so absolute, so suffocatingly dense, that you could hear the faint, microscopic crackle of the ice melting in a glass of Glenfiddich 3 tables over. Arthur Vance, a man who had spent the last 40 years operating under the unspoken assumption that the universe was a wholly owned subsidiary of Vance Holdings, looked as though someone had just struck him across the face with a heavy ledger. The silver at his temples seemed to lose its luster. The rigid, aristocratic set of his shoulders suddenly turned hollow. He looked at Vivian's hand, still resting with an immovable, possessive weight against the small of my back. Then he looked into her eyes, 2 bottomless pools of black volcanic glass that offered 0 quarter and promised absolute devastation. "You're making a very dangerous mistake, Vivian," Arthur said. His voice was a dry, reedy rattle, the sound of an old radiator trying to summon heat. "Firms survive on legacy. They survive on alliances. You cross my family for a vendor, and you will find the boardrooms of this city remarkably chilly." Vivian didn't raise her voice by a single decibel. She didn't need to. Her tone carried the terrifying, localized gravity of a black hole. "I do not rely on alliances to keep me warm, Arthur. I rely on my win-loss record, she murmured smoothly, her thumb giving my waist a slow, imperceptible stroke that sent a wild, hot spike of adrenaline straight through my nervous system. And as of this morning, my record remains entirely unblemished. Your son attempted to commit grand larceny via a forged judicial instrument. If you utter the word vendor in reference to my partner again, the next gala you attend will be the annual fundraiser for the federal penitentiary system. Do not test my vocabulary tonight. Arthur's jaw worked silently. For 3 agonizing seconds, the titan of New York real estate looked like a man standing on the tracks watching the 5:15 express train round the bend. Without another word, he turned his back, signaling to his 2 associates with a sharp, jerky twitch of his head, and practically vanished into the sea of black tuxedos. The moment his broad back disappeared behind a pillar, the ambient chatter of the ballroom slammed back into existence like a tidal wave. Dozens of surrounding attorneys who had been pretending to study their cocktail napkins suddenly commenced frantic, whispered debates. Vivian didn't look at them. She didn't check her watch. "You have endured enough cheap Prosecco and fragile egos for one evening," she murmured, her hands sliding from my waist to catch my wrist. "Come." She didn't lead me back toward the main bar nor toward the exit. She guided me through a pair of heavy, arched velvet curtains at the far end of the hall, pushing open a set of double glass doors that led out onto a sprawling, secluded stone loggia overlooking the misty, dark expanse of Central Park. The heavy glass doors clicked shut behind us, instantly muting the roar of the gala into a dull, rhythmic bass thump. Cool, damp New York night air hit my bare skin like a splash of cold water, making the fine hairs on my arms stand up. The loggia was illuminated only by the pale, silver spill of the moonlight and the distant, golden grid of the Fifth Avenue skyline. Vivian let go of my wrist. She walked over to the heavy stone balustrade, placed both hands upon the carved granite, and looked out over the canopy of the park. With a slow, agonizingly deliberate flick of her long fingers, she reached up to her collar. She unknotted the black silk bow tie, letting the 2 dark ribbons hang loose down the front of her crisp white shirt, and unbuttoned the top 2 pearlescent buttons. The sheer, effortless masculinity of the gesture, the total dismantling of her severe, untouchable boardroom armor, made my throat go completely dry. "Explain that," I said. My voice was shaking, but not from fear. It was the sound of a bowstring drawn back to its absolute mechanical limit. I stood 4 feet away from her, my hands balled into fists at my sides. Vivian didn't turn around immediately. She kept her eyes on the dark horizon. "Explain what, Miss Davies?" "What you just said to Arthur Vance," I said, taking 2 deliberate steps toward her. The heels of my custom loafers clicked sharply against the flagstones. "Something that belongs to me. Was that a strategic deployment of legalese, Vivian? Was that a corporate smokescreen to establish jurisdictional dominance over Aura's assets? Or was that something else?" Slowly, Vivian turned her back to the park, leaning her hips against the cold stone of the balustrade. In the pale moonlight, her face looked sculpted out of ivory. Her obsidian eyes locked onto mine, tracking the rapid, frantic rise and fall of the black silk camisole beneath my tailored jacket. The dangerous, predatory amusement had completely vanished from her expression, replaced by a stillness so profound it felt like the moment right before a lightning strike. "When I sat in my office at midnight on Monday and read your source code, Chloe, I saw a mind that operated in pure, uncompromised geometry," Vivian said softly. Her smoky contralto drifted through the damp air, wrapping around me like a heavy velvet cloak. "I saw a woman who had built a cathedral out of pure math, while the mediocre men around her were busy trying to take credit for the stained glass." She pushed herself off the balustrade. She took 1 slow step forward, then another. She didn't stop until her pointed Louboutin stilettos were practically resting against the toes of my shoes. The heat radiating off her velvet tuxedo in the chilly night air was intoxicating, smelling of crushed cedarwood and expensive scotch. "Do you honestly believe," Vivian whispered, leaning down just enough to bring her gaze level with mine, "that I would put a $2 million titanium vault around your life's work, publicly castrate a billionaire family on the floor of the Pierre Hotel, and risk a censure from the New York State Ethics Board, purely as a matter of jurisdictional dominance? My breath hitched, catching painfully in the back of my throat. I couldn't look away from her. Then what is it? Tell me the invoice terms, Vivian. Tell me where the lawyer ends and you begin. A dark, breathtaking micro-expression flickered across her lips, a look of pure, hungry reverence. She reached out. Her long, warm fingers didn't catch my lapel this time. They slid upwards, her palm coming to rest flat against the side of my neck, her thumb sweeping upward to trace the sensitive, pulsing line beneath my ear. Contrast of her scorching skin against the damp, cold night air made me gasp out loud, my eyes fluttering half shut for a fraction of a second. The lawyer ended the moment I slid that notepad across the defense table on Tuesday morning, little bird, Vivian murmured. Her voice dropped into a register so dark, so gravelly and private, that it vibrated directly against my collarbones. Everything since that precise second has been entirely, flagrantly, selfishly me. My heart was hammering a frantic, trapped rhythm against her palm. I reached up, my smaller hand wrapping tightly around her forearm, feeling the hard, flexed muscle beneath the black velvet of her sleeve. I am not a subsidiary, Vivian, I whispered, my voice fierce despite the way my knees were trembling. I survived Liam Vance. I built my company with my own bleeding fingernails. If you think you can collect me like a vintage watch or a penthouse view— I don't want to collect you, Chloe, she interrupted softly. Her thumb moved from my jaw, gently tracing the outline of my lower lip, the light pressure parting my mouth just enough to let her feel the hot flutter of my exhale. Her dark eyes dropped to my mouth, anchored there with an intensity that felt like a physical consumption. I want to stand behind you, Vivian whispered, her face closing the distance until her lips were hovering a mere millimeter from my own, the ghost of her breath mingling with mine. I want to hand you the matchbox, point you toward the dry brush of this industry, and stand back while you set the entire godforsaken skyline on fire. You belong to the future you are building. And I am the wall standing between you and anyone who tries to put the flames out. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the declaration hit me like a shot of pure oxygen. My fingers tightened around her velvet sleeve. I tilted my chin upward, closing the final, maddening fraction of an inch between us, craving the strike. BZZT. BZZT. A sharp, violent, high-priority vibration shattered the vacuum of the loggia, emanating from the inside pocket of Vivian's tuxedo jacket. We froze. For 3 long, agonizing seconds, Vivian didn't pull back. She kept her forehead resting gently against mine, her eyes closed, letting out a long, ragged, deeply frustrated sigh that fanned warm across my cheeks. The legendary glacial apex predator looked, for the very first time in her life, profoundly annoyed to be needed. Slowly, she opened her eyes. The dark obsidian was swimming with an unfulfilled, dangerous heat. If this is not an active thermodynamic emergency, Vivian muttered, reaching into her jacket and pulling out her encrypted sleek black device, I am going to throw my chief of staff into the Hudson River. She swiped the screen, holding the phone to her ear while keeping her left hand firmly anchored against the back of my neck, refusing to sever our physical tether. Speak. I watched her face as she listened. The warm, devastatingly sensual woman who had just offered to burn New York down for me vanished in the span of 2 syllables. The sharp, severe, terrifying architecture of Vivian Crawford returned. Her jaw set into a line of pale granite, her dark eyes narrowed into 2 freezing, lethal slits as she stared out into the dark trees of the park. When? Vivian asked. Her voice was back to absolute zero. A pause. I see. And the server hosts? Another pause. A cold, terrifying little smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. Let them try. Do not file the countermotion. Let them assemble the quorum. She lowered the phone, tapped the screen once, and slipped it back into her velvet pocket. She turned her head back to me. Her hand slid from the nape of my neck, her fingers trailing a slow, electric path down my shoulder before dropping to her side. What happened? I asked, my founder's panic instantly overriding the lingering haze of the near kiss. Is it aura? Arthur Vance is a creature of predictable, antiquated habits, Vivian said, adjusting the lapels of her tuxedo jacket with two sharp, crisp tugs. He knows he cannot beat us inside a courtroom, so he has spent the last hour calling in 40 years of backroom favors. He has convened an emergency, unlisted midnight meeting of the Enterprise Digital Infrastructure Syndicate. My blood ran cold. The syndicate was the shadowy, 5-member institutional board that controlled the primary fiber optic routing hubs for the entire eastern seaboard. If they vote to blackball Aura's IP addresses, your Friday deployment fails, Vivian finished for me, her voice ringing with a dark, thrilling calm. Your software becomes unreachable. Your $2 million valuation turns into a dead link. I stared at her, the sheer, suffocating weight of the old boys' network threatening to crush the breath back out of my lungs. Can we get an injunction? Can we call a judge? Vivian looked at me. She didn't look worried. She looked like a grandmaster who had just watched her opponent move his queen onto a trapped square. Slowly, she reached out, her thumb gently brushing a stray lock of hair away from my forehead. We are not calling a judge, Chloe, Vivian whispered, her dark eyes glinting with pure, unadulterated legal violence. A judge asks for precedent. A judge asks for patience. She turned toward the double glass doors of the loggia, her black stilettos striking the stone with that familiar, deadly clack, clack, clack. We are going to Teterboro Airport, Vivian commanded over her shoulder, her voice echoing into the night. My jet is fueled. We are flying to Boston to pay the chairman of the syndicate a personal visit at his country estate before his morning coffee finishes brewing. Put your armor back on, Miss Davies. It is time you learned how Monopoly is actually broken. End of Part 5. Part 6. The Law of Absolute Altitude. The Maybach did not obey the posted speed limits of the New Jersey Turnpike. It swallowed them whole. Sitting in the cavernous rear cabin as Marcus threaded the massive black sedan through the sparse, damp 1 a.m. traffic, I felt like a deep-sea diver who had been brought up to the surface far too quickly. The nitrogen was bubbling in my blood. 30 minutes ago, I had been standing on a moonlit loggia, inches away from being consumed by a woman in a pitch-black velvet tuxedo. Now, my laptop was balanced on my knees, its screen casting a sickly, pale blue light across the dark Napa leather as I watched the live telemetry of Aura's server nodes turn a slow, catastrophic shade of amber. Packet loss is at 22% across the Tier 1 transit gateways, I muttered, my fingers flying across the terminal window, trying to manually force an alternate handshake protocol. They haven't issued a hard IP block yet, but they're choking the bandwidth at the root. By 4 a.m., our automated client backups will time out. By 8 a.m., the DNS registries will start dropping us as an unstable host. Vivian sat on the opposite side of the cabin, her profile illuminated by the passing amber glow of the highway streetlights. She had her encrypted black phone pressed to her ear, listening to an automated dispatch voice with a look of terrifying, beautiful placidity. Tell the chief dispatcher at Teterboro that if my flight plan isn't prioritized for an immediate unqueued departure, I will personally look into the zoning variances on their newly constructed south hangar, Vivian said into the receiver. Her voice was smooth, frictionless, and entirely devoid of heat. Yes. 2 passengers. Wheels up the second my heels touched the tarmac. She ended the call, dropped the device onto the center console, and turned her head toward me. Close the machine, Chloe, she commanded softly. Vivian, if I stop rerouting the traffic manually, the Eastern Regional Cluster goes down before we even cross the Connecticut state line. I said close it, she repeated. She reached across the wide leather divide, her warm, long index finger catching the top edge of my MacBook screen and gently pressing it downward until the latch clicked shut, plunging the car back into the intimate, cedar-scented dark. You cannot fix an institutional assassination with a line of Python, little bird. You are treating a political ambush like a technical glitch. Look at me. I swallowed hard, my raw, bitten cuticles aching as I let my hands fall into my lap. I turned to look at her. In the shadows of the car, the unbuttoned collar of her white silk shirt looked impossibly bright, the loose ribbons of her black bow tie resting against her collarbones like the aftermath of a riot. "Julian Sterling," Vivian said, pronouncing the name as if it were a particularly stubborn stain on a cuff. "The chairman of the Enterprise Digital Infrastructure Syndicate. He is 74 years old, sits on the board of 3 private equity firms, and treats the North American fiber optic grid as his personal train set. Arthur Vance didn't call the 5-member board tonight. He called Julian. They belong to the same summer club in Nantucket. They speak the same dead language. Then how do we talk to him?" I asked, my voice tight, the high-altitude panic vibrating in my molars. "If he's an untouchable billionaire who does favors for Arthur Vance over Scotch, what possible leverage does a Queen's digital agency have to make him lift the throttle?" A slow, devastatingly sharp smile curved Vivian's painted lips. Passing headlights caught the dark, volcanic glint in her obsidian eyes. "A Queen's digital agency has 0 leverage," Vivian murmured, leaning her tall frame slightly across the center console toward me. "But Crawford, Sterling & Vance is the firm that spent 8 months in 2021 restructuring Julian's personal tax shelters in the Isle of Man to prevent the IRS from piercing his corporate veil. I know the exact routing numbers of the shell entities that pay for his third wife's real estate portfolio. I know the legal vulnerabilities of his eldest son's import business. I hold the blueprints to his life's architecture, Chloe. And Julian knows that if I decide to pull out a single load-bearing pillar, his entire dynasty collapses into the Atlantic Ocean." Before I could fully process the sheer, cold-blooded scope of her professional arsenal, the Maybach took a hard, sweeping right turn, passing through a high-security chain-link gate flanked by 2 armed guards. We had arrived at Teterboro Airport. Sitting on the slick, rain-swept private tarmac, bathed in the harsh white glare of the halogen floodlights, was a massive, sweeping Gulfstream G650ER. Twin Rolls-Royce engines were already emitting a low, deafening, high-frequency whine that vibrated right through the soles of my shoes as Marcus brought the sedan to a halt at the foot of the airstairs. Transition from the car to the jet was a masterclass in frictionless wealth. There were no TSA bins, there were no boarding passes. A sleek, silver-haired flight attendant in a dark charcoal uniform stood at the top of the steps, holding a massive golf umbrella over the doorway. "Good morning, Ms. Crawford," the attendant said, stepping back to grant us entry into the cabin. "Morning, Elena," Vivian said briskly, stepping into the aircraft without breaking her stride. "We are wheels up immediately. Bring Miss Davies a double shot of the dark roast espresso, bring me a glass of the San Pellegrino with a twist of lime, and then lock the forward galley divide. We are not to be disturbed until we begin our initial descent into Bedford." "Understood, ma'am." The interior of Vivian's Gulfstream didn't look like an airplane. It looked like a high-altitude boardroom wrapped in Loro Piana cashmere and dark Macassar ebony. There were no rows of seats, only 4 massive, custom-contoured executive armchairs upholstered in pale cream leather, grouped around a high-gloss walnut conference table, and a sprawling, low-slung velvet divan in the aft section. I sank into the leather armchair facing the forward bulkhead, my knees still trembling faintly from the sheer kinetic velocity of the night. Vivian didn't sit down immediately. She stood in the center of the wide aisle, her pointed Louboutins planted firmly against the plush lambswool carpet as the heavy exterior door sealed shut with a deep pneumatic thud. With a slow, effortless grace, she slipped her arms out of her custom black velvet tuxedo jacket, tossing the priceless garment carelessly onto the velvet divan. She turned around, her white silk shirt clinging to the sharp, lean lines of her torso, the sleeves rolled up twice to reveal pale, strong forearms corded with subtle, elegant veins. The breath hitched so violently in my throat that I had to look down at the polished walnut table to keep from completely losing my composure. "You're shivering," Vivian noted. Her voice had dropped its sharp operational edge, returning to that low, smoky contralto that seemed to alter the atmospheric pressure of the room. "The cabin air it's a little brisk," I lied. My skin was practically scorching beneath my midnight navy blazer. Vivian didn't call Elena back. She walked over to the aft divan, picked up a folded, impossibly thick Loro Piana charcoal cashmere blanket, and walked back over to my seat. Instead of handing it to me, she dropped to one knee. The visual of Vivian Crawford, the apex predator of the New York bar, a woman whose mere signature moved billions of dollars across international borders, kneeling on the carpet beside my chair hit my brain like a short circuit. She unfolded the heavy cashmere, draping it over my lap, her long, manicured hands carefully tucking the soft wool in around my thighs and calves. Her palms lingered on the sides of my knees, the ambient heat of her touch burning straight through the fine fabric of my suit. "Vivian," I whispered, my voice coming out in a ragged, breathless flutter. You shouldn't be on the floor." Vivian slowly tilted her chin up. Her dark obsidian eyes caught the soft, warm pool of the overhead reading light, swimming with a look of intense, unhurried possessiveness that made my stomach execute a wild, erratic somersault. "I am precisely where I desire to be, Chloe," she murmured, her thumbs executing a slow, maddeningly gentle sweep across my kneecaps. "On the loggia, you asked me to tell you where the lawyer ends and I begin." She slowly slid her right hand upward, her warm palm sliding along the inside of my calf, coming to rest with a heavy, grounding pressure just above my knee. "The lawyer spent the last 20 minutes calculating the legal liability of destroying Julian Sterling's transit hub," Vivian whispered, leaning her face in until I could smell the rich, peaty Macallan still lingering on her breath. "The lawyer secured your $2 million valuation. But the woman kneeling in front of you is currently experiencing a very dark, very intense surge of territorial jealousy because you spent the entire ride to the airport staring at an amber terminal window instead of looking at her." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I reached down, my smaller, trembling fingers wrapping around her wrist, feeling the heavy silver links of her Patek Philippe watch digging into my palm. "My company is bleeding out in the dark, Vivian," I breathed out, my gaze dropping irresistibly to her parted, painted lips. "If Julian Sterling doesn't lift the block—" "Julian Sterling is an algorithm, little bird," Vivian interrupted softly. Her free hand reached up, her long fingers catching my chin, tilting my face downward to meet her dark, scorching gaze. "He is an input-output machine. When I lay his offshore ledgers on his breakfast table at 5:30 a.m., his survival instinct will override his loyalty to Arthur Vance in the span of 4 heartbeats. The syndicate block will be purged before the morning markets open. The business is already concluded." Her thumb moved from my chin, slowly tracing the sensitive, damp line of my lower lip. The sheer, intoxicating gravity of her presence was pulling me entirely out of my own body. "Which leaves us," Vivian whispered, her voice dropping into a dark, gravelly register that made the fine hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up, "with 42 minutes of flight time." She didn't close the final millimeter between our lips. Instead, she leaned her head to the side, her open mouth pressing right against the frantic, hammering pulse point at the side of my throat. The sudden, scorching contact of her lips against my bare skin sent a wild, liquid bolt of pure electricity shooting straight down my spine. I gasped out loud, my eyes fluttering shut, my fingers tightening around her wrists like a lifeline. She held her lips against my skin, her breath fanning hot and rhythmic against my collarbones, inhaling the scent of my skin as if she were committing it to legal record. "Sleep, Chloe," Vivian ordered softly against my throat, her hand giving my thigh one last, heavy, immovably possessive squeeze before she gracefully rose to her feet. "When we land at Hanscom, I need your posture rigid and your eyes clear. You are going to stand beside me, and you are going to watch me take a king off the board." 4:15 a.m., the Gulfstream's heavy landing gear struck the rain-slicked runway of Hanscom Field in Bedford, Massachusetts. There was no Maybach waiting for us here. Idling on the dark, foggy tarmac was a pitch-black, fully armored Range Rover Sentinel, driven by a man whose thick neck and broken nose suggested he had spent his formative years in the Special Forces rather than a livery service. We drove through the ancient, sleeping, tree-choked backroads of Lincoln. The New England coastal fog hung heavy and thick in the pines, turning the world into a silent, monochrome ghost ship. By 4:45 a.m., the Range Rover turned down a private, unmarked, mile-long gravel driveway flanked by towering 200-year-old weeping willows. The end of the drive stood a massive 12-foot-tall wrought iron gate, secured by a heavy magnetic lock and a reinforced security gatehouse. The driver didn't roll his window down to speak to the guard. He simply tapped a small tablet mounted to the dashboard, transmitting Vivian's encrypted digital signet directly to the gatehouse receiver. Inside the illuminated glass booth, I watched the private security guard look down at his monitor. His eyes widened into two massive pale circles of pure existential terror as he read the name authorized on the security manifest, Vivian Crawford. He didn't pick up the telephone to call the main house. He didn't ask for a physical ID. He slammed his palm onto the green release button so hard the console shook. The heavy iron gates groaned open. We glided up the sweeping circular driveway, pulling to a halt at the foot of the wide limestone steps of Sterling Manor, a sprawling 20-room Gilded Age estate that looked like a fortress built out of old money and cold stone. The damp, freezing Massachusetts morning air hit us the second we stepped out of the Range Rover. Vivian stood on the gravel, shrugging her shoulders back into her custom black velvet tuxedo jacket. In the dim pre-dawn light, with her dark hair pushed back and her jawline set into a line of pale, merciless granite, she didn't look like a corporate attorney. She looked like an executioner arriving at the dawn of a revolution. She turned to me, extending her left arm, offering her elbow. "Put your shoulders back, little bird," Vivian murmured, her low, smoky voice cutting through the silent New England fog like a blade. "We are about to ruin a billionaire's breakfast." End of Part 6. Part 7, The Siege of Sterling Manor. The limestone facade of Sterling Manor loomed out of the freezing New England mist like the mausoleum of an unpunished king. As Vivian and I ascended the wide, dew-slicked steps, the heavy oak double doors at the main entrance swung inward before we could even reach the brass threshold. Standing in the foyer was a man in a masterfully tailored morning coat, his silver hair slicked back with an absolute, rigid precision. It was Kensington, the legendary head of the Sterling household staff, a man who had spent 40 years acting as the human moat around Julian Sterling's private life. "Ms. Crawford," Kensington said, his voice dropping into a register of profound, icy reprimand as he moved his body to physically block the grand marble hallway. "This is an unconscionable breach of estate protocol. Mr. Sterling is currently conducting his morning meditation in the solarium. He is not to be—" "Kensington," Vivian interrupted. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even break her slow, sweeping stride. She simply stepped to within 6 inches of the man's waistcoat, her dark obsidian eyes fixing onto his with the terrifying, localized gravity of a falling guillotine. "If you utter another syllable of the English language, I will personally place a call to the Massachusetts Department of Revenue regarding the 24 cases of 1982 Chateau Margaux missing from the South Cellar, and the corresponding uninvoiced deposits made to your sister's checking account in South Boston. Do we understand one another?" Kensington's face turned the color of curdled milk. The rigid, aristocratic set of his shoulders collapsed instantly. Without a single word of rebuttal, he took 2 rapid, frantic steps backward, pressing his spine flat against the silk-lined wall of the foyer to grant her safe passage. "Flawless," Vivian murmured smoothly, not looking at him again. She reached out, her hand wrapping firmly around the inside of my wrist, pulling me into the warmth of her side. "Come, little bird. Let's go watch an empire expire." We moved through the cavernous, silent corridors of the manor. The walls were lined with massive, somber oil portraits of 19th-century industrialists staring down at us with cold, painted eyes. Walking beneath the weight of that entrenched, centuries-old patriarchy should have made me feel like an intruder, but looking at the sharp, magnificent silhouette of Vivian Crawford's black velvet tuxedo ahead of me, the entire fortress felt as fragile as a house of wet paper. Vivian pushed open a set of towering, leaded glass double doors, leading us down 3 sunken stone steps into the solarium. The room was a suffocatingly humid sanctuary of towering date palms, blooming white orchids, and the sharp, damp scent of turned earth. Sitting at the far end of the glass greenhouse, bathed in the pale, milky light of the 5:15 a.m. sunrise, was Julian Sterling. He was 74 years old, wrapped in a heavy, floor-length Loro Piana Vicuña wool dressing gown that looked worth more than the entire Queen's block I grew up on. He was sitting at a glass-topped wrought iron table, slowly stirring a Meissen porcelain teacup with a tiny silver spoon. He didn't look up immediately, assuming the footsteps belonged to his butler. I told you, Kensington, Julian rasped, his voice sounding like dry autumn leaves being crushed under a boot. The thermostat in the Orchid Bay is 2 degrees too high. The petals are beginning to clack. Vivian dropped her slim, black calfskin briefcase onto the center of the glass table, landing 3 inches from his saucer. Julian's head snapped up. The tiny silver spoon slipped from his fingers, clattering sharply against the priceless porcelain. His watery blue eyes widened into 2 massive, pale orbs of pure, unadulterated shock. "Vivian!" he barked, his voice cracking with sudden reedy fury as he half stood from his chair. "What the devil is the meaning of this? You broke past my staff? I am a senior stakeholder in your firm. I will have the state troopers drag you off my property in irons before the sun clears the trees." Vivian didn't take a seat. She stood over him in her stilettos, claiming the vertical expanse of the glass room, casting a long, dark shadow right across his breakfast spread. Slowly, with an agonizing, theatrical calm, she popped the silver clasps of her briefcase. She extracted a single, slim black leather folder, opened it, and slid a single printed sheet of archival paper across the glass until it was resting directly over his toast rack. "Sit down, Julian," Vivian commanded softly. Her voice was an absolute 0-degree draft blowing through the humid greenhouse. "And look at Exhibit A." Julian's jaw worked silently. He glared at her, but the sheer, crushing weight of her authority forced him slowly back down into his wicker chair. His trembling, liver-spotted hand reached out, picking up the paper. I watched his eyes dart across the top line of text. Then I watched his breathing entirely stop. "That," Vivian murmured, leaning her hands on the edge of the glass table, her voice dropping into a dark, smoky contralto of pure legal execution, "is the master ledger for Vanguard Holdings Limited, registered in Douglas, Isle of Man. Details the untaxed, quarterly wire transfers of $750,000 from your domestic infrastructure syndicate accounts into a private entity registered under the maiden name of Ms. Genevieve Laurent in Zurich." Julian's face turned a horrifying, mottled shade of gray. The heavy vicuña robe suddenly looked 3 sizes too big for his frail frame. How did you get these encryption logs?" "Your father locked these specific physical files in the central firm vault in 2018. My father is a relic who believed that hoarding rich men's secrets was a substitute for having a spine," Vivian countered smoothly. "I am the managing partner of Crawford, Sterling, and Vance Julian. My name is the first word on the letterhead. I hold the digital master keys to every skeleton buried in our sub-basement." Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing pathetically against his wrinkled throat. He looked from the paper, past Vivian's shoulder, and locked his watery eyes onto me. A sudden, desperate, ugly sneer twisted his mouth. "You're doing this?" Julian hissed, his voice trembling with disbelief. "You're burning my family's legacy to the ground over her?" "Arthur Vance called me at midnight. He said some little Queen's software vendor was trying to shake his boy down, but I didn't think you'd commit professional suicide over a piece of collateral damage." Bang! Vivian's open palm struck the glass tabletop. The kinetic force of the blow was so violent the Meissen teacup actually fractured, a hairline crack shooting through the painted blue porcelain as lukewarm Earl Grey spilled across the glass. The glacial, untouchable legal architect vanished in a millisecond. What replaced her was an entity of pure, scorching, terrifying violence. Vivian leaned across the table until her face was hovering a mere 4 inches from Julian's nose. Her obsidian eyes were wide, swallowing every stray beam of the dawn light. "Julian," Vivian whispered. Her voice was pitched so low it felt like the sudden, deafening drop in atmospheric pressure right before a house is torn from its foundations. "If the word vendor exits your mouth in reference to my partner again, I will not merely submit this unredacted ledger to the Southern District of New York. I will hand-deliver it to the front desk of the Boston Globe. I will ensure your third wife's divorce attorneys receive the Zurich routing numbers by 9 a.m., your 3 sons spend the next 15 years litigating your frozen estate in probate court, and your family's name is chiseled off the side of the Sterling School of Economics before the end of the fiscal quarter." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze dropping to his trembling mouth before locking back onto his eyes. I will dismantle the architecture of your life so thoroughly, Julian, that by the time I am finished, your grandchildren will have to legally change their surnames just to secure a mortgage. Do not test my appetite for ruin this morning. The silence inside the solarium was absolute. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic drip-drip-drip of the spilled tea falling from the edge of the glass table onto the stone floor. Julian Sterling looked into Vivian Crawford's eyes, and he saw the terrifying, inescapable truth. She wasn't bluffing. She would do it. She would burn his 60-year dynasty to ash, warm her hands over the embers, and sleep soundly for 8 hours afterward. His hand was shaking so violently he could barely lift the receiver of his gold-plated desk phone. He pressed a single speed dial button. "Network operations," Julian croaked into the speaker, his voice entirely devoid of life. It's Sterling. Directive 904B, the regional infrastructure throttling on the Aura digital routing nodes. Revoke it. Immediate priority. Yes. Flush the DNS blacklist entirely. Issue the clear handshake protocol to their primary server cluster right now. He dropped the receiver back onto the cradle. He looked up at Vivian, looking like a hollowed-out ghost. "You're a monster, Vivian. You're going to die entirely alone in that glass tower of yours." Vivian slowly stood up straight. With an exquisite, unhurried grace, she buttoned the center button of her black velvet tuxedo jacket. "I am an upgrade, Julian," she murmured smoothly. She snapped her briefcase shut, picked it up, and turned her back to him entirely. "Check your machine, Miss Davies." My hands were shaking as I unlatched my MacBook, resting it on my forearm as the screen woke up. I stared at the terminal window. The sickly, catastrophic amber lines of code flickered once. Twice. Then, a wave of pristine, luminous green washed down the screen. Ping response, 11 milliseconds. Packet loss, 0%. Transit gateway, unrestricted. Status, secure and online. I looked up from the screen, my eyes burning with a sudden, overwhelming rush of unshed tears. "It's green," I whispered. "Vivian, it's completely green." Vivian didn't smile at Julian. She looked at me, her dark eyes softening into something so fierce, private, and fiercely proud it made my breath trap itself behind my ribs. "Of course it is, little bird," she murmured, extending her hand toward the double doors. "Let's go home." Walking back out into the sweeping circular driveway, the New England mist had finally begun to clear, the sharp, brilliant golden rays of the morning sun piercing the weeping willows. We climbed into the cavernous rear cabin of the armored Range Rover. The heavy door sealed shut behind us, and before Marcus could even put the vehicle into drive, Vivian reached out and hit the silver console button. Whir. The black privacy partition glided upward, sealing the two of us inside our soundproof leather vacuum. The second the glass clicked shut, the massive 80-hour adrenaline high of the week finally, truly crashed into my nervous system. My laptop slipped from my fingers, landing softly onto the lambswool carpet. I sank back against the dark leather seat, covering my face with both hands as a wild, ragged, half-sobbed laugh broke out of my chest. We had won. Aura was untouchable. The old boys' network had been broken over a breakfast table. "Chloe," Vivian's voice murmured. I felt her hands, warm, strong, and smelling of crushed cedarwood, gently capture my wrists, peeling my trembling fingers away from my face. I opened my eyes. Vivian hadn't stayed on her side of the wide cabin. She had shifted across the dark leather, her tall frame positioning itself so close to mine that our thighs were pressed flush together. Her velvet tuxedo jacket was unbuttoned, her white silk dress shirt open at the throat, her dark obsidian eyes swimming with an intense, unbridled, dangerously possessive heat. She looked high on the absolute exercise of supreme power. She didn't drop to her knees this time. Instead, her hands slid up my forearms, wrapping firmly around the peaks of my shoulders, and with a slow, irresistible upward pressure, practically pulled my smaller frame across the console until I was half resting in her lap. You're shaking, I breathed out, my hands instinctively coming up to rest flat against the hard, warm expanse of her chest, feeling her pulse hammering a wild, frantic rhythm against her silk shirt. Vivian, you're actually shaking. Because I have spent the last 3 hours acting as a civilized corporate officer when what I truly wanted to do was take Julian Sterling's throat in my teeth, Vivian whispered. Her smoky voice was so dark, so gravelly and intimate, it felt like a brand against my skin. Her manicured hand slid up the back of my neck, her long fingers tangling deep into my hair, tilting my face upward until our lips were a mere paper-thin breath apart. Look at me, Chloe, she ordered softly, her thumb tracing the damp line of my parted mouth, sending a bolt of pure, liquid fire straight down to my toes. Tell me, what do you want me to conquer for you next? End of Part 7. Part 8, The Jurisdiction of Touch. The space between my mouth and Vivian Crawford's was a localized hazard zone, heavy with the scent of old peat, crushed cedar wood, and the wild electric friction of a broken boundary. What do you want me to conquer for you next? She had whispered. For 26 years, my survival mechanism had been self-erasure. When my father left, I made myself quiet. When my college professors talked over my code, I made myself smaller. When Liam Vance spent 4 years slowly siphoning the oxygen out of my life, I convinced myself that breathing shallowly was a reasonable price to pay for peace. But looking up into Vivian's dark, volcanic obsidian eyes that had just brought the most powerful infrastructure syndicate on the eastern seaboard to its knees purely so my software could run on time, the concept of being small felt like a mortal sin. I didn't pull back. I reached up, both of my smaller hands wrapping around the sharp, tailored peaks of her velvet lapels, and I exerted a fierce, desperate downward pressure, pulling her tall frame the final millimeter into my space. I don't want a conquered world, Vivian, I whispered against the damp, warm skin of her lower lip. I want the conqueror. A sound left Vivian's throat, a low, dark, possessive growl that vibrated directly against my collarbones. Her mouth didn't ask for permission, it took absolute jurisdiction. The collision of her lips against mine was not a soft, tentative exploration. It was a masterclass in total consumption. Her lips were scorching, tasting of rich Macallan and expensive mint, moving over mine with a heavy, deliberate, inescapable demand that made the back of my neck arch into her palm. Her long, manicured fingers tangled brutally deep into the hair at the base of my skull, anchoring my head in place as her tongue swept along the seam of my lips, coaxing them apart with a smooth, lethal authority. A wild, ragged gasp tore out of my throat, instantly swallowed by her mouth. The sheer kinetic velocity of her touch sent a liquid bolt of pure fire shooting straight down my spine, melting the wet papier-mâché of my knees into absolute ash. I twisted my fingers deeper into her black velvet tuxedo jacket, my body instinctively arching upward off the leather seat to press flush against the hard, lean lines of her torso. Through the fine silk of her open shirt, I could feel the frantic, heavy hammering of her heart, a wild, trapped rhythm that matched my own beat for beat. She broke the kiss for a fraction of a second, her lips trailing a wet, burning path to the sensitive corner of my mouth, then down to the frantic pulse point hammering at my jawline. You are going to be the absolute death of my billable hours, Chloe Davies, Vivian murmured roughly against my skin, her warm breath fanning across my wet lips as her hand slid from my neck, wrapping around my waist with an immovable, grounding grip. Look at me. I fluttered my eyes open, my vision swimming in a warm, golden haze. Vivian was looking down at me, her painted lips slightly swollen, her dark hair falling out of its severe, perfect sweep to frame a face that looked entirely, beautifully unhinged by desire. She reached up, her thumb executing a slow, tracing path across my lower lip, collecting the moisture there with a dark, hungry reverence. When we land in New York, Vivian whispered, her voice dropping into a register of sheer, protective possessiveness, you are going to deploy your software. You are going to secure your fortress. And then you are going to come back to my penthouse, and I am going to show you exactly what happens when I am no longer operating under the constraints of a legal brief. Friday morning at 8:55 a.m., the Queen's headquarters of Aura Digital smelled of burnt espresso, stale pizza boxes, and pure, concentrated human adrenaline. I stood at the head of the glass conference room, wearing the raw Italian raw silk suit Vivian had commissioned for me. The ivory fabric caught the harsh fluorescent lighting of the bullpen, making my shoulders look broad, sharp, and immovable. Grouped around the central monitor were my 12 developers, their eyes glued to the master terminal window as the global atomic clock ticked toward the hour. 8 hours 59 minutes and 57 seconds. 8 hours 59 minutes and 58 seconds. 8 hours 59 minutes and 59 seconds. Execute handshake, I commanded smoothly. My lead engineer, Marcus, slammed his palm onto the return key. For 3 agonizing, silent seconds, the terminal window remained a blank, empty void of black. My heart did a slow, terrified revolution in my chest. Had Julian Sterling found a secondary kill switch? Had the syndicate rerouted the DNS tables at the last second? Then, the screen exploded into a cascading waterfall of pure, luminous green. Transit Gateway, Boston Regional, clear. Packet loss, 0%. Client backup pipeline, 100% synchronized. Status live. The bullpen didn't just cheer, it detonated. Marcus practically hoisted his desk chair into the air. Sarah, my assistant, popped the cork on a bottle of cheap Prosecco so hard it ricocheted off the acoustic ceiling tiles. I stood in the center of the chaos, a slow, profound wave of absolute sovereignty washing over my skin. We were alive. Company was secure. I turned my head, looking through the double glass doors of the conference room toward my private office. Leaning casually against the mahogany doorframe, holding a plain white ceramic mug of black coffee, was Vivian Crawford. She had changed into a fresh, immaculate 3-piece charcoal slate suit, her dark hair tucked flawlessly back behind her ears, the untouchable corporate apex predator fully restored. But as our eyes met through the glass across the cheering room, the severe glacial mask slipped for a fraction of a millimeter. She didn't raise her coffee mug in a toast. She didn't smile. She simply gave me a single, slow, profound dip of her chin, the look of a grandmaster watching her favorite piece sweep the board. By 2 p.m., the Euphoria was operating at maximum cruising altitude. We had closed 3 new enterprise accounts on the strength of the morning's flawless deployment. The Series A venture capital term sheets were piling up on my credenza like wedding invitations. I was sitting at my desk, drafting a network expansion charter, when the double doors of my office flew open so hard the brass handles struck the drywall. Sarah stood in the threshold. Prosecco flush had completely vanished from her face, leaving her looking the color of skim milk. She was clutching her iPad to her chest like a shield. "Chloe," Sarah croaked, her voice trembling violently. "Turn on CNBC. Right now." I frowned, reaching for the remote on my desk. "Sarah, what's?" "Just turn it on," she practically screamed. I hit the power button. The massive 60-inch flat screen mounted to my wall flickered to life, tuned to the live broadcast of Squawk on the Street. Chiron running across the bottom of the screen in aggressive, bold yellow graphics read, "Exclusive, Aura Digital co-founder alleges predatory corporate conspiracy." Sitting at the live anchor desk, wearing a soft beige cashmere crewneck sweater that looked engineered to make him appear as harmless and victimized as humanly possible, was Liam Vance. Flanking him on his left was a man with slicked-back hair and a sharp, cheap pinstripe suit, a notoriously sleazy tabloid crisis manager named Richard Sterling, Julian Sterling's estranged, bottom-feeding nephew. "Look, Andrew," Liam was saying to the anchor, his voice trembling with a masterfully calculated, tear-choked crack. "I didn't want to bring this into the public forum. I love Aura. I built that code from a folding table in Queens. I gave 4 years of my life, my personal credit, my family's resources to support Chloe Davies when nobody else believed in her." He looked directly into the studio camera, his golden brown eyes wide, swimming with genuine sociopathic crocodile tears. "And the very week our proprietary compression engine reaches a multi-million-dollar institutional valuation, Chloe initiated a covert, highly unethical personal relationship with a senior partner at my own family's law firm, Vivian Crawford." The anchor's eyebrows shot up. "Mr. Vance, those are profound allegations. Are you suggesting the $2 million credit facility extended by Crawford Ventures was..." It was a coordinated shakedown, Liam interrupted, wiping a single tragic tear from his cheek. Vivian Crawford exploited her access to my family's privileged legal files to force me out of my own company, while Miss Davies used intimate leverage to secure 95% of the voting stock. My father received threats. My primary transit vendors were blackmailed at 5 a.m. this morning. It is a textbook instance of corporate conversion disguised as a feminist startup success story. The ticker at the bottom of the screen updated instantly. CC Ethics watchdogs probing Crawford Ventures tie to Aura Digital. The phone on Sarah's desk outside the glass began to ring. Then the secondary line. Within 10 seconds, the entire office switchboard was lit up in a frantic, blinking grid of catastrophic red. My stomach plummeted straight through the floorboards, hitting the concrete subbasement. He hadn't attacked my code. He had attacked her license. In the New York corporate circuit, an ethics inquiry into an undisclosed romantic relationship between an attorney and a client during an active hostile substitution of counsel wasn't just a scandal, it was an automatic, career-ending disbarment. Liam and Julian Sterling's nephew had realized they couldn't break the titanium vault around Aura's bank accounts, so they had decided to poison the well, framing Vivian as a corrupt, predatory litigator who traded legal muscle for sexual favors. "Chloe," Sarah whispered, staring at the blinking phone grid. It's the Wall Street Journal. And Bloomberg. They're asking for comment on the affair. I slowly stood up from my desk, my hands trembling so hard I had to grip the edge of the mahogany to keep my balance. I looked away from the television, my terrified eyes darting across the room to the credenza. Vivian was standing there. She hadn't dropped her coffee mug. She hadn't flinched. She was staring at Liam's weeping face on the high-definition screen with an expression of such profound, absolute sub-zero stillness that the air in the room felt instantly converted into liquid nitrogen. "Vivian," I breathed out, my voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. "Your license. If the Bar Association sees this broadcast, if they subpoena the flight logs from Teterboro last night..." Vivian slowly set her white ceramic mug down onto the credenza. Clink of the porcelain was the only sound in the frozen room. She turned around. The dark obsidian of her eyes wasn't swimming with panic. It was glittering with a cold, terrifying, historic appetite for absolute slaughter. "He thinks he has built a guillotine out of a cable news hit piece," Vivian murmured smoothly, her black Louboutin striking the floor in a rhythmic, deadly clack-clack-clack as she walked over to my desk. She didn't look at Sarah. "Sarah, step outside and shut the door." Sarah practically evaporated from the room, the heavy oak door clicking smartly shut behind her. Vivian rounded the desk, stepping right into my space. She took my freezing, calloused hands in hers, lifting them up, and with an agonizing, deliberate tenderness that entirely defied the nuclear crisis unfolding on the screen behind us, pressed her lips to my raw, bitten cuticles. "Vivian, please," I begged, tears finally spilling over my lower eyelids. "We have to issue a denial. We have to tell the bar we're strictly professional. I'll step down as CEO, I'll put the shares in a blind trust. I won't let him take your firm from you." "Chloe," Vivian interrupted softly. She reached up, her warm palms capturing my wet cheeks, tilting my face up until my frantic gaze was locked entirely inside her dark, immovable sights. "A professional denial is defensive," Vivian whispered, her smoky voice ringing with a magnificent, terrifying authority. "It tells the sharks that we are bleeding. It tells the ethics board that we have something to hide." She let go of my face, reaching into her tailored waistcoat to extract her sleek, encrypted black device. She dialed a single digit, putting the phone on speaker and setting it onto the center of my desk. "Chief of Staff," a crisp, terrified voice answered instantly. "Miss Crawford, the switchboard is..." "Silence, Eleanor," Vivian commanded. Her voice was an executive broadsword slicing through the panic. "Draft an immediate Tier 1 press release to every beat reporter at Bloomberg, the New York Times, and Reuters. Secure the Grand Ballroom at the Plaza Hotel for 10 a.m. Monday." "A press conference, ma'am? To address the conversion allegations?" A slow, devastating, breathtaking smile broke across Vivian Crawford's face, the look of an immortal creature preparing to swallow a mortal world whole. "We are not addressing Mr. Vance's pathetic little conversion fantasy, Eleanor," Vivian murmured smoothly, her dark eyes dropping to my parted mouth, lingering there with an intense public possessiveness that made my toes curl inside my loafers. "We are issuing the formal institutional announcement." She reached out, her long fingers smoothly capturing my left hand, her thumb rubbing a slow, heavy circle over my bare ring finger. "Of my upcoming marriage to the Chief Executive Officer of Aura Digital." End of Part 8. Part 9. The Legalese of a Love Letter. The word marriage did not merely drop into the acoustic vacuum of my queen's office. It struck the polished concrete floor like a live mortar shell. On the speakerphone, Vivian's chief of staff, Eleanor, emitted a sound that was half gasp, half strangulation. For 5 agonizing seconds, the digital line hummed with the absolute terrifying realization of what the managing partner of New York's most feared corporate litigation firm had just put on the institutional record. "Ms. Crawford, I will have the plaza's grand ballroom secured within the hour," Eleanor finally managed, her voice entirely stripped of its administrative poise. "And the press release." "Keep the prose sparse, Eleanor," Vivian commanded smoothly, her hand still wrapped immovably around my left hand, her thumb tracing the bare skin of my ring finger. "No flowery matrimonial clichés. We are not a lifestyle brand. Frame it as the natural, long-planned consolidation of Crawford Ventures' primary digital holdings. The media may have their little circus at 10 o'clock Monday, but they will conduct it under my vocabulary." Dismissed. Call clicked dead. The moment the screen went black, the paralysis keeping me upright finally shattered. I yanked my hand out of Vivian's grip, backing away until the small of my back hit the edge of my glass white bards. "Marriage!" my voice cracked, shooting into a pitch so high it practically vibrated the dry erase markers off their ledge. "Vivian, have you lost your absolute analytical mind? Liam goes on national television to accuse you of predatory legal conversion, and your strategic rebuttal is to commit matrimonial perjury?" Vivian didn't flinch. She didn't rush to placate me. She simply reached into her tailored waistcoat, extracted her silver Montblanc pen, and began slowly, methodically rolling it between her long palms as she walked toward me. "It is not perjury, Miss Davies. It is an impenetrable jurisdictional shield," Vivian murmured, her low, smoky contralto instantly dropping the room's temperature back to a cool, operational baseline. "Under Section 4502 of the New York Civil Practice Law and Rules, the state recognizes absolute spousal privilege. The moment our marriage certificate is filed at the county clerk's office, Liam's entire subpoena for my private communications, my personal banking ledgers, and my midnight visits to your source code becomes demonstrably legally void. A wife cannot be compelled to offer discovery against her wife." "You're talking about a marriage of convenience to beat an ethics probe." "I am talking about controlling the narrative typography of this city," Vivian corrected softly. She stopped 2 feet from me, the heavy, intoxicating scent of her cedarwood perfume washing over my frantic senses. "Public is a simple, predictable organism, Chloe. They despise a ruthless, cold-blooded corporate attorney who uses legal leverage to conquer a small startup. But do you know what they adore? A slow, devastating micro-expression of pure, theatrical triumph flickered at the corner of her painted mouth. They adore a fiercely protective, wealthy legal titan who steps into a courtroom to rescue the brilliant, exploited tech genius woman she is wildly, privately in love with from a mediocre, abusive ex-fiancé. Liam thinks he just framed us as Bonnie and Clyde. By noon on Monday, I will have the hosts of Good Morning America weeping over our wedding registry." I stared at her, my brain short-circuiting as it tried to balance the sheer, cold-blooded legal mechanics of her argument against the wild, scorching heat radiating off her pinstriped silhouette. "Vivian," I whispered, my voice dropping into a ragged, desperate register. "People get married because they have a shared history. Because they know each other's middle names. We have known each other for precisely 96 hours. Vivian reached out. Her warm, long fingers didn't catch my lapel this time. They slid behind my neck, her palm cupping the base of my skull with a heavy, immovably grounding weight. She leaned her tall frame down until her forehead was resting gently against mine, her dark obsidian eyes locking onto my frantic gaze. "I have known the flawless geometry of your mind for 96 hours, Chloe," Vivian whispered, her breath fanning warm and scotch-scented across my trembling lips. "That is 84 hours longer than I have tolerated the vast majority of the human species. Now, pack your briefcase. My driver is outside. We have a total systemic inventory to conduct before the jewelers close." By 6 p.m., the Maybach had bypassed the retail crush of Fifth Avenue entirely, gliding into the subterranean private loading bay of a heavily guarded high-rise in the Diamond District. We were not taken to a showroom. We were escorted via a biometric elevator into a silent, high-security subterranean viewing vault wrapped in gray acoustic velvet. Sitting at the center of the room behind a table of black felt was an elderly, impeccably dressed Swiss diamond merchant named Monsieur Laurent, flanked by two silent, armed guards. "Ms. Crawford," Laurent said, bowing his head with the profound reverence reserved for heads of state. "The private reserve has been pulled from the Geneva transit logs as you instructed." He unlatched a heavy, matte black steel briefcase, folding the lid back to reveal 6 individual illuminated velvet cradles. The stones resting inside were so massive, so blindingly clear, that they looked less like jewelry and more like weaponized fragments of the sun. Vivian didn't sit down. She stood over the felt table, her hands tucked deep into the pockets of her charcoal slate trousers, surveying the diamonds with the cold, hypercritical eye of a master architect reviewing a faulty blueprint. "No," Vivian said, her voice brisk and dismissive as she pointed a long finger at a breathtaking 4-carat round brilliant cut. "Too traditional. Suggests a suburban compromise. And remove the pear shape, it lacks structural integrity." Her dark eyes tracked across the felt, stopping at the very last cradle in the corner. She reached out, her thumb and forefinger lifting a ring from the velvet. It was an absolute masterpiece of severe, uncompromising geometry. It was a 6-carat, flawless emerald-cut diamond, entirely devoid of standard filigree, halo, or ornamental softness. The massive, rectangular step-cut stone was held in a heavy, brutalist tension setting of brushed, cold-rolled platinum. It looked sharp enough to cut glass, heavy enough to sink a ship, and entirely, breathtakingly untouchable. Vivian didn't ask Monsieur Laurent for the carat weight or the clarity grade. She turned around, stepping directly into my space. "Give me your left hand, Chloe," she ordered softly. My hand was trembling so violently that my scuffed cuticles looked like a minor seismic event. I lifted my arm up. Vivian took my wrist in her warm grip. With an agonizing, slow, deliberate pressure, she slid the heavy, cold band of platinum over my knuckles. The metal caught the skin for a fraction of a second before settling flush against the base of my finger. The physical weight of the stone was astonishing. Felt like an anchor. Felt like a brand. I looked down at my hand, then up into Vivian's dark, waiting eyes. Vivian, this is the size of a postage stamp. It looks like an executive order." A slow, genuinely breathtaking smile curved Vivian's lips, the first completely uncalculated look of pure, private satisfaction I had seen on her face all evening. She lifted my hand up, pressing her warm, soft lips directly to the cold table of the diamond, then lingering against the sensitive skin of my inner wrist. "It matches your ivory suit, little bird," she murmured against my pulse. She didn't look back at the merchant. "Laurent, send the invoice directly to my family's private trust office in Zurich. If a single detail regarding the cut or the carat weight leaks to page 6 before Monday morning, I will personally look into the customs declarations on your Antwerp imports. Absolute discretion, Ms. Crawford. Always." Saturday morning at 7 a.m., the Tribeca penthouse was a silent, sun-drenched sanctuary of black coffee, scattered legal pads, and the absolute pinnacle of high-stakes corporate drafting. Vivian sat at the head of the 10-foot black walnut dining table, wearing a loose, unbuttoned white silk shirt and her reading glasses. Spread between us was a fresh, 40-page legal document printed on heavy, cream-colored archival paper. Prenuptial asset merger and indemnification agreement. Read it, Vivian said, taking a slow sip of her espresso. I pulled the heavy document toward me. For the last 24 hours, my survival instincts had been screaming that this was the moment the jaws of the trap would finally snap shut. A woman who buys 6-carat flawless emerald-cut diamonds does not enter a marriage contract without ensuring she owns the deed to her partner's future. I flipped past the standard real estate waivers, bypassed the mutual non-disclosures, and went straight to Section 8, separate intellectual property and post-union dissolution. I traced my index finger down the dense, bolded legalese. Then my finger froze. I blinked, rereading subsection 8.43 consecutive times to ensure the early hour wasn't causing a visual hallucination. Subsection 8.4. In the event of a legal separation, dissolution, or divorce initiated by either party, the digital architecture entity known as Aura Digital Solutions shall remain the 100% unencumbered sole intellectual property of the respondent, Chloe Davies. Petitioner, Vivian Crawford, hereby explicitly waives all statutory rights to community appreciation, equity conversion, or venture capital clawbacks. I looked up from the paper. Vivian was leaning back in her black walnut chair, her reading glasses perched at the bridge of her sharp nose, watching me with an expression of total, unblinking placidity. "Vivian," I said, my voice dropping into a tight, strained whisper. "This says if we get married on Monday and I file for divorce on Tuesday, keep the $2 million. I keep 95% of the voting stock. And you leave with literally zero exit collateral. Your illegal reading comprehension remains a profound turn-on, Miss Davies." "I'm serious." I stood up, the heavy platinum ring on my finger striking the wood with a sharp clack. "Vivian, standard high-net-worth prenups are designed to build a moat around the wealthier party. You have built a moat around me and left your own drawbridge completely down. If this is a strategic corporate play to beat Liam Vance's ethics inquiry, why are you handing me the legal power to bankrupt your venture fund?" Vivian slowly took off her reading glasses, setting them down onto the contract. With that terrifying, effortless grace, she pushed herself out of her chair, walked the slow steps around the table, and stepped right into my personal space. She didn't offer a polite explanation. She reached down, her warm hands capturing my waist, lifting my smaller frame bodily onto the edge of the polished black walnut table so that we were sitting at an absolute, inescapable eye level. She reached up, her thumb gently tracing the line of my jaw, her dark obsidian eyes burning with a fierce, possessive intensity that made the breath completely vanish from my lungs. "Because a standard prenup is written by lawyers who anticipate failure, Chloe," Vivian whispered. Her smoky contralto was so dark, so gravelly and private, it vibrated right against my skin. "And I do not fail. When I place my ring on your finger on Monday morning, I am not merely purchasing an alibi for the Bar Association. I am placing the absolute, terrifying entirety of my professional leverage at your mercy." Her hand moved from my jaw, sliding down to capture my left hand, lifting the heavy platinum diamond up between our faces. "This contract," Vivian murmured, her lips brushing the bare skin of my knuckles, "is my vocabulary. It is the only way a woman like me knows how to tell you that you are completely, irrevocably safe. Liam Vance spent 4 years making you feel like a tenant in your own life. I am handing you the deed to the entire godforsaken building. Now, sign the paper. And then come to bed." I couldn't speak. I looked from the clinical, bulletproof legalese of subsection 8.4 up into the dark, volcanic, fiercely devoted eyes of the woman who had written it. I realized in that shattering millisecond that Vivian Crawford hadn't just drafted a contract. She had written me a love letter in the only language she trusted. I grabbed the silver Montblanc pen. I didn't check the remaining 30 pages. I flipped to the back, found the signature line above the words Chloe Davies, future wife, and signed my name in bold, wet black ink. The moment the pen lifted from the paper, Vivian's hands tangled deep into my hair. Her mouth didn't ask for terms. It took total, absolute possession of my lips, pulling me backward onto the cool, scattered drafts of our new life. End of Part 9. Part 10, The Sovereign Ledger. The Manhattan County Clerk's office at 8:15 a.m. on a Monday smelled of wet linoleum, lukewarm radiator iron, and municipal exhaustion. Sitting behind the bulletproof plexiglass partition of window 3 was a 50-something civil servant named Brenda, whose purple reading glasses were secured around her neck by a beaded chain. Brenda had spent 22 years issuing marriage licenses to frantic elopers, hungover tourists, and shivering couples in practical winter coats. She had never, in her 2 decades of bureaucratic service, looked across the scarred formica counter at a bespoke 3-piece double-breasted black wool tuxedo paired with an uncompromising 6-carat flawless emerald-cut diamond. Brenda looked at the heavy archival paper resting on her desk. She looked up at Vivian Crawford's sharp, pale, aristocratic jawline. Then, her eyes drifted to me, standing in my custom-tailored ivory raw silk armor, my left hand anchored so firmly inside Vivian's right hand that our pulses were practically keeping the same internal time. You're waiving the 24-hour waiting period via a judicial signet?" Brenda asked, her voice dropping into a hushed, disbelieving whisper as she inspected the embossed gold seal of a New York State Supreme Court appellate judge attached to the back of our application. "Judge Abernathy owes me a profound personal favor regarding the zoning of his upstate trout hatchery, Brenda," Vivian replied smoothly, her low, smoky contralto cutting through the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights. "And my schedule this morning is remarkably unaccommodating to municipal delays." "The blue ink, please." Brenda didn't argue. "You didn't argue with an localized weather event." She picked up a heavy wooden municipal stamp, pressed it into the ink pad, and brought it down onto the bottom left corner of the certificate with a sharp, definitive, echoing thwack. She signed her initials across the seal, slid the pristine document back under the plexiglass slot, and offered a small, deeply bewildered nod of her chin. "You're legal." "Congratulations, ladies." Vivian didn't reach for her calfskin briefcase. She picked up the stamped certificate, folded it twice with an agonizing, masterfully precise geometry, and slipped it into the inside breast pocket of her velvet-lapelled tuxedo jacket, right over her heart. Slowly, she turned her tall frame to face me. In the harsh, unforgiving glare of the municipal lobby, the dark obsidian of her eyes wasn't cold. It was swimming with a fierce, quiet, historic triumph. She reached out, her long index finger gently hooking my chin, tilting my face upward until my breath hitched against my ribs. "Good morning, Mrs. Crawford," Vivian whispered softly, the peaty warmth of her morning espresso fanning across my lips. "Chloe Davies," I corrected her, my voice trembling, though a wild, radiant sovereign pride was blooming straight up my spine. Subsection 8.4 explicitly establishes separate operational identity, counselor. You signed the memo. A slow, genuinely devastating micro-expression of pure, unadulterated worship flickered across Vivian's painted mouth. She didn't kiss me, not with 3 waiting paralegals staring at us from the back benches, but her thumb pressed a slow, scorching brand against my jawline before slipping down to capture my hand once more. "God, I adore your syntax," Vivian murmured. She checked her slim silver Patek Philippe watch. It is 8:28 a.m. Press corps has been consuming lukewarm drip coffee in the Plaza Ballroom for 40 minutes. Let's go give them their digestion issues. At 9:55 a.m., the pitch-black Maybach glided to a halt at the side entrance of the Plaza Hotel. The moment Marcus popped the door locks, the ambient, muffled roar of the New York press corps hit the glass like a physical tidal wave. A localized army of private security contractors in sharp gray suits instantly formed a human wedge across the sidewalk, holding back a chaotic, blinding strobe light wall of 40 different flashbulbs. "Keep your eyes strictly on the base of my neck, Chloe," Vivian commanded as we stepped out onto the concrete. "Do not look at the lenses. A camera lens is an interrogation. We do not grant them discovery." She didn't offer me her elbow. She placed her warm, immovable palm directly against the small of my back, guiding my smaller ivory silhouette through the chaos with the terrifying absolute gravity of an icebreaker ship slicing through a frozen sea. Shouted, frantic fragments of the English language rained down on our shoulders. "Miss Crawford, does the $2 million wire constitute a..." "Chloe, Liam Vance claims you locked him out of the servers on." "Vivian, Is the Bar Association issuing an emergency suspension before? We pushed through the gilded double doors, bypassing the main lobby entirely as Eleanor, Vivian's pale, hyper-efficient chief of staff, practically jogged ahead of us to throw open the towering oak double doors of the grand ballroom. The room was a suffocating, packed amphitheater of high-definition broadcast lenses, wooden podiums, and the calculating, cynical eyes of the most ruthless financial journalists in North America. Sitting in the front row, his laptop open on his knees, was Tom, the notoriously severe, silver-haired lead corporate investigative reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Vivian walked up the 3 carpeted steps to the main staging riser. She didn't stand at the podium alone. She stepped to the side, claiming the vertical expanse of the room, but pulled me directly flush against her right shoulder, ensuring that every single broadcast camera in the room had to frame our silhouettes as an indivisible, monolithic unit. She leaned down to the cluster of 20 different foam-tipped microphones. She didn't tap the metal. She simply waited for 3 long, agonizing seconds until the sheer, suffocating weight of her silence forced the frantic ballroom down into absolute 0-decibel submission. "Ladies and gentlemen of the institutional press," Vivian began. Her smoky contralto rolled over the plaza's master acoustic system, crisp, frictionless, and entirely devoid of defensive heat. "We will not be conducting a standard question-and-answer session this morning. I am a corporate litigator. When I wish to dismantle a man's financial architecture, I do not use the morning broadcast of CNBC. I use the commercial division of the New York State Supreme Court." She placed her hands flat on the edges of the mahogany podium. "Yesterday afternoon, an individual named Liam Vance offered a demonstrably perjured, highly entertaining piece of speculative fiction regarding the capitalization of Aura Digital Solutions. He suggested that Crawford Ventures engaged in a predatory legal conversion of his assets. I will address this fantasy precisely once." Vivian's dark eyes narrowed into 2 freezing volcanic slits as she swept her gaze across the front row, locking onto the Wall Street Journal reporter. Mr. Vance's claim to Aura Digital was legally vacated on Tuesday morning by the Honorable Judge Arthur Abernathy, following the discovery that Mr. Vance had submitted forged federal timestamp receipts to the court. As of 9 a.m. today, the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York unsealed a formal grand jury indictment against Liam Vance for 2 counts of offering a false instrument for filing and 1 count of wire fraud. A collective, stunned, audible gasp practically sucked the oxygen out of the back rows of the ballroom. Pencils snapped. Laptops rattled. "Furthermore," Vivian continued, raising her voice by a fraction of an octave to project over the rising wave of frantic murmurs, "Mr. Vance's primary angel investors have exercised an immediate total clawback of his operating capital. His board of directors has voted unanimously to remove him as chief executive officer, and his father, Arthur Vance, has formally severed all personal and financial ties to his son to preserve the Vance family's remaining institutional liquidity. Mr. Vance is currently a bankrupt, unindicted federal suspect. His opinions regarding the software sector are legally irrelevant." Tom from the Wall Street Journal practically leaped out of his front row chair, disregarding the no-question protocol entirely. "Ms. Crawford!" Tom shouted, his voice echoing off the gilded ceiling. "Even if Vance's equity claim is fraudulent, the State Bar Ethics Board confirmed an open inquiry at midnight regarding an undisclosed romantic relationship between you and Miss Davies during an active substitution of counsel. If you leveraged your firm's resources to secure a personal relationship with a client, that is an automatic disbarment. Do you deny the relationship?" The entire ballroom froze, 40 camera lenses zooming in simultaneously to catch the kill-shot micro-expression on Vivian's face. Vivian didn't flinch. She didn't look at Tom. Slowly, with an exquisite, unhurried, agonizingly theatrical grace, she reached out her left hand. She captured my left wrist, lifting my smaller hand up from my side, and placed my open palm directly onto the center of the dark mahogany podium, right beside the microphones. The harsh, concentrated white beams of the broadcast spotlight struck the brushed platinum tension setting of the 6-carat emerald-cut diamond. The stone didn't just sparkle, it fractured the light into a blinding, razor-sharp white prism that practically scorched the retinas of the front row. I cannot confirm or deny the nature of my personal relationship with a client, Tom, Vivian murmured smoothly, her dark eyes glittering with absolute historic legal violence as she reached into her tuxedo jacket and extracted the folded piece of municipal paper. She unfolded it once, twice, and laid the blue-stamped Manhattan County Clerk's certificate face up on the wood. Because pursuant to Section 4502 of the New York Civil Practice Law and Rules, Vivian announced, her voice ringing out like a heavy bronze bell tolling the end of a war, the state of New York recognizes that Miss Chloe Davies is no longer my client. She is my wife. Tom's mouth literally dropped open, his pen slipping from his fingers. And under the absolute statutory protections of statewide spousal privilege, Vivian finished, her hand sliding down to wrap her long fingers possessively through mine, holding our joined hands high above the podium, my private communications, my personal bank ledgers, and my midnight visits to my wife's source code are permanently, irrevocably sealed from this or any future inquiry. The jurisdiction of the Bar Association ended at window 3 of City Hall. Good morning, gentlemen. Checkmate. Vivian didn't wait for the explosion. She didn't watch the 40 financial reporters practically trample each other to get their smartphone lenses over the blue ink of Brenda's stamp. She turned her body, wrapped her arm immovably around my waist, and swept me down the back staging stairs and out through the service corridors before the first broadcast cheering could even hit the screens. The Maybach was already idling in the subterranean loading tunnel beneath the plaza. We practically tumbled into the cavernous rear cabin, Marcus hitting the accelerator so hard the massive sedan left a brief, high-frequency chirp of rubber against the concrete before shooting out into the blinding, brilliant midday sunshine of Central Park South. Whir! The black glass privacy partition glided upward, sealing the two of us inside our soundproof Napa leather vacuum. The moment the motorized hum clicked dead, the crushing, monolithic architecture of the legendary Vivian Crawford finally completely dissolved. She didn't sit back in her seat. She dropped her phone onto the lambswool carpet, turned her tall frame entirely across the wide seat, and buried her face directly into the crook of my neck, letting out a long, ragged, impossibly heavy sigh that fanned hot and damp against my collarbones. "Vivian!" I breathed out, my smaller hands instantly coming up to frame her face, my thumbs tracing the high, sharp peaks of her cheekbones. Her skin was scorching. "Look at me. Vivian, look at me." She slowly opened her eyes. The dark volcanic obsidian was completely stripped of its boardroom armor, leaving behind an expression so raw, so fiercely, privately tender that it made my eyes burn with sudden, overwhelming tears. "You're crying, little bird," Vivian whispered roughly, her long fingers coming up to gently catch a wet drop escaping my eyelid. "Because my terminal window is green," I sobbed out, a wild, ragged laugh breaking through my chest as I leaned my forehead down to rest flush against hers. "I checked the stock ticker while we were walking down the hall, Vivian." Aura didn't drop. "The market just valued our Series A at $45 million. You didn't just beat Liam, you made us a monopoly." "I told you on the loggia, Chloe," Vivian murmured softly, her manicured thumb tracing the outline of my trembling lower lip, the light pressure parting my mouth just enough to let her taste the sweet, intoxicating breath of our victory. "I only provide the matchbox. You are the flame." She didn't ask for jurisdiction this time. She surrendered to it entirely. When her mouth captured mine, there was no legal brief standing between us, no tactical geometry left to calculate. It was slow, deep, and impossibly heavy, a profound, resonant, unhurried consumption that tasted of old peat, expensive rain, and the absolute terrifying peace of finally being known. My fingers tangled deep into the dark, silky hair at the base of her skull, my body shifting across the console until I was resting entirely in the lap of the woman who had looked across a mahogany defense table 5 days ago and decided to alter the typography of my life. I looked down at our joined hands resting against the dark leather, the scuffed, calloused fingers of a Queen's database architect locked permanently inside the flawless 6-carat brushed platinum of New York's most ruthless litigator. "Keep your eyes on me, Chloe," she had written on that yellow legal pad. I leaned my chin against her shoulder, watching the brilliant golden grid of the Manhattan skyline roll past our tinted windows, and realized I was never going to look away again. End of story / the end. And that is how you dismantle a narcissist's entire existence, while simultaneously securing the highest valuation in the tech sector. What makes Vivian and Chloe's dynamic so utterly addictive isn't the Maybachs, the Patek Philippe watches, or the 6-carat diamonds. It is the fundamental, breathtaking contrast between Liam and Vivian. Liam spent 4 years trying to convince Chloe she was a passenger in her own life, purely because he was terrified of her potential. Vivian took one look at her source code and decided to build a titanium fortress around her, just to sit back and watch her set the skyline on fire. That is the ultimate shift from "you're nothing without me" to "show them what happens when I stand behind you." And let's be honest, we all need a Vivian Crawford in our corner. Now, I need to hear from you down in the comments. Which Vivian mic drop moment was your absolute favorite? Was it the handwritten note across the defense table in Part 1, the 5:15 a.m. tea-shattering threat in the greenhouse, or the ultimate spousal privilege checkmate at the Plaza Hotel? Drop your favorite scene below. I'm going to be reading and hearting as many as I can. If this story gave you absolute chills and kept you hooked until the very last word, please do me a massive favor and hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that we want more high-stakes, high-powered GL romance on this platform. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring that notification bell because I have another incredible story already in the works, and trust me, you do not want to miss the hook on that one. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Keep your standards high, never let anyone make your silhouette apologize for existing, and I'll see you in the next video.